working knowledge of the neighbor countries. All of this, he really, Gendun Chögyal brought out. He also brought a real modern approach to understanding the history of Tibet using modern methods, because modern historical methods don't emphasize the importance of traditional sources, but rather archaeological evidence becomes very important, and then whatever happens to be the contemporary sources take greater precedence, and then compared to actual historical text, you give more credence to the actual texts such as letters that are written, communications, and so on. So this is a modern historical method of analysis which Gendun Chögyal brought to Tibetan history. He then wrote the unfinished White Annals, which is the first modern style history of Tibet written in Tibetan. Okay? So the younger generation of Tibetans, if you don't know Gendun Chögyal, there's a huge hole in your understanding and knowledge of Tibetan culture and history. Okay, in Tibet, Gendun Chögyal is celebrated. There are galleries named after him. There are, halls named after him. There are buildings named after him. There are museums named after him. He's really seen as the greatest modern Tibetan. Okay, so Gendun Chögyal, there are a few passages that I will read from Gendun Chögyal, okay? Gendun Chögyal was the first Tibetan to really come across the Tonghang historical material, and when he read these Tonghang materials, he was very fascinated, and he says that looking at these Tonghang materials, he says that the records were kept of the Tibetan emperors at the time of what month, what date, where they were. It turns out during Songtsen Gampo's time, a large part of Nepal was under Tibet. So the king was moving to Nepal during winter when it was too cold. So then he talks about how in the 7th century, the Tibetan army even went up to India and invaded Kanyakubja, which is the central Indian empire at the time. And Songtsen Gampo was contemporary of Harsha Vardhana, one of the greatest Indian emperors. Harsha was a sympathizer and supporter of Buddhism. The Chinese Xuanzang, the traveler, who went to India, was very well looked after by Harsha. And when he returned, the Tang emperor sent a delegation to thank Harsha. But by that time, Harsha was dead, and Harsha's kingdom has been usurped by one of his ministers, and who mistreated the Chinese delegation and seized all the offerings. And then the Chinese delegation reported back to Tang, and the Tang emperor is just too far away from India, and because Songtsen Gampo was married to a Chinese princess, he begged Songtsen Gampo to bring justice, take a revenge. So Songtsen Gampo sent down a military expedition all the way down from Tibet, crossed the Ganges, invaded India, and occupied the capital, Kanyakubja, and arrested that king and brought him back. So you can see the sort of the power of Tibet at the time. So Gendun Chögyal is talking about that. So I'll read this in Tibetan. He says that then he's lamenting the fact that most of the Tibetan history was written by Buddhist monks, and they overemphasize the religious dimension, and they underplay the importance of Tibetan imperial achievements. And he says that che ngunjengi chungwa pena gyagardo lepte gyaga yuugi gyasa kanya kubcha sungji gebu sirup zundu chute chongche chung gyadang gyeju zang pyoge bangsu tsubada peyu ne dekong ngamoshi ne pyoge chawo do chute mirabjik lasam temyusu debada gyana riwu zenga ne gel ne pyoge pungjen lepte kongmaya rangya lenjik tile pabada 대중 두구다 리유다 유넨소야 벽이 오도 로 야다 학벌 내버서 Demba rado tong to be gerab ge chane, jodo pangwa dendrataya. So he's really saying that all of these things that I refer to, unfortunately, in traditional Tibetan history, they were forgotten because they don't have much to do with Buddhism. So he's pointing out that history, when you write history, you really need to write both about Buddhism and culture, but also about its military and empire and so on. So the point I'm trying to make is that when we think of Tibet, okay, we need to think all the way back to the 6th century. And particularly the younger generation of Tibetans, as long as our struggle remains, we need to have a sophisticated understanding of our own history and what it means to be Tibetan, and also a conflicting narratives that would come from different sources. So if we are not secure in our own narrative, then we don't have the confidence to really respond to another conflicting narrative. And this, I think, is a very important point I'm trying to make. The details of the history can be read elsewhere, but what is important is to really have an appreciation that during the imperial period, Tibet was as powerful as the competing empires at the time, the Chinese Empire, the Persian Empire, the Arabs, and the Turks, okay? Now, of course, after the fall of the imperial Tibet, then Tibet went through what is called Silpu. It's when the central authority got dismantled. Tibet became ruled by small kingdoms in different regions, like in the western Tibet, there was the Kuki kingdom, Ngari, there were many different kingdoms. And then in the Yuan period, which is in the 13th century, as the Mongol invasion of mainland China took place, then Khodan Khan army came to Tibet, and in the 13th century, then the Mongolians, they became devotees of the Sakya Pandita, and through that way, the Sakya rule came to Tibet. The Sakyas ruled, and after that, there were a couple of different rules, but then, so those are complicated, So the Sakya rule from 1270 to 1354, next comes Pagdu rule, and in the Pagdu rule, the one who founded the Pagdu rule is Tai Situ Changju Gyaltsen. He was actually quite an impressive ruler, and because in the Yuan, Sakya rule was, supported by the Yuan, there were a lot of Mongolian influence in Tibet, and what Pagdu founder did was to really bring back the old imperial systems of dress. So today, many of the Tibetan aristocratic dress that we see really began more from the Pagdu period, because Pagdu was really wanted to bring back the imperial Tibetan habit. And it was during this period that Tsongkhapa was active. Then very briefly, Rinpoche took over. Then there was a brief period of Tsangpa. And then the Dalai Lama's rule began in the 17th century until 1959 in Tibet. So that's a broad brush in history. Now, from a historical kind of point of view, particularly thinking about our struggle, there are few important points in history that you really need to understand a bit more in order to fully appreciate our narrative. One is the Yuan period during the Sakya rule. Sometimes the counter-narrative makes the case because Sakyapas were ruling on behalf of the Yuan emperor, which was then ruling China, that Tibet became part of China. So that's one argument that is brought, and Tibetans need to understand what are the basis for that particular line of thinking and argument, okay? After the Sakya rule, there was hardly any influence from China in Tibet. Then, during the 7th Dalai Lama period, there was 2 Gorkha invasions in Tibet from Nepal in the 18th century. And during the 2nd Gorkha invasion, Tibetans were not able to repel the Gorkhas, then sought the help of the Qing emperor, And at that time, the Qing emperors were Tibetan Buddhists. They were all followers of the Gelug teachings. And through close connection between the Gelug lamas, particularly Panchen Lama and the Qing emperor, then the Qing soldiers came to Tibet. And in fact, the head of the Qing army was not a Han Chinese. It was deliberate. The Qings were Manchus. They were not Hans. They were Manchus. So then, after repelling the Gurkhas, then the Qing established a presence in Tibet through some proxy system. Okay? So again, so that is another period that is sometimes used as a counter-narrative to show that Tibet was in fact ruled by the Chinese. Now, those are complicated arguments. I think the Tibetan, particularly the educated ones, it is our responsibility to read about this, to know, and as much as possible to be objective. You cannot say there was never any influence in Tibet by the Chinese. Of course there were. Yuans were there. Influence was there. Qings were there. But one thing that is we have to understand, and here modern scholarship is helpful. There is one historian at Columbia, Great Tuttle, his book, Makings of Modern Tibetan Lamas in the Making of Modern Tibet. He makes a very important point. He said that even when Qing emperors had some authority in Tibet, they never considered Tibet as part of China. They considered Tibet as part of Qing Empire. So that's a very different kind of argument, because during the Qing period, part of Korea was also under the Qing Empire. Okay? Qing also absorbed part of Nepal as part of its empire. So it's a different kind of argument. Okay, so these are, I think for us Tibetans, especially the educated ones, okay, those who can read English, there are so many modern studies that really shed light on this, and we need to, so that the sensitive periods are really, the imperial period is not an issue, because sometimes in the old days, argument was made that because when Qin Kongzhou married the princess, a Tibetan emperor, therefore Tibet became part of China. But that's ridiculous. So that argument is no longer brought up. Now the arguments are really the Yuan period and then the Qing period. And those two periods we need to know, because the Tibetans' own history is sometimes not that clear. And part of the history requires comparison of different sources, not just Tibetan sources, but the Chinese sources and other sources like the Arab sources and so on. So that I just wanted to share with you, because you're going to get a lot of other speakers' future, but I thought I would give you this broad outline of history first, so that we have a sense of who we are as Tibetans, okay? Now, these days it's not fashionable to make arguments from the ethnicity, but from an ethnicity point of view, the fact that Tibetans are very different from our brother and sister Chinese is demonstrated by a recent study that came out quite a while ago, actually, maybe about 10 years ago. It was a genetic study that showed that the Tibetans are one of the very few races that have acquired a certain mutation that adapts us at this high altitude. Even the people in the Andes did not have it. So these are, and genetic mutations take a long period of time. So that suggests that we are actually, even racially, very different. Now, as to the future of what kind of political structure Tibet should have is a different question. And here, with His Holiness's wise leadership, Tibetans have basically agreed to find a middle way solution where we can protect our identity within the larger People's Republic of China. And I think the distinction should be made between China and PRC. People's Republic of China is a modern nation. It began only at the beginning of the 20th century. China is an ancient nation. And another distinction that we need to make is between nation and country. According to the middle way policy, there will be only one country, but Tibet should be a nation. And distinction between nation and country It's a difficult concept in Tibetan because we don't have two different words. But in English, we do. If you look at Great Britain, Scotland, and Wales are nations. They are not country. They are nations. Because they are nations, at the Olympics level, they are represented separately. So that doesn't undermine the integrity of Great Britain. So we need these kind of sophisticated thinking in the way in which we think about who we are. And we should never give up our nationhood. I think the notion of a nation, and here we can learn a little bit from the resilience of the sense of nationhood by the Native Americans. They have an idea of a nationhood. So I think that this distinction between nation and country, and I think these kind of things with Tibetans, we really need to know. So racially we are different, and linguistically, Tibetan language is very different from Chinese. Tibetan language, although we use the writing system that is based on Indian system, but the language itself is very different from Indian language. The Tibetan language is very different from Indian language. The closest language we have is Burmese. Burmese is the only close language that we have in the language family. And there is hardly any linguistically connection between Tibetan language and Chinese language. So linguistically, we are very different. And because we must have been different nations, because language evolved over thousands and thousands of years. Written language may be new, the spoken language are thousands of years old. And spoken language, Tibetan, the fact that it is so different suggests that we were a completely different people for a long time, occupying that huge plateau in Tibet. So we need to have, if we are serious about our identity of who we are as Tibetan, we need to have an emotional attachment to the land. Tibet, this in the old text talks about high peaks, snowy peaks, mountain, azure blue skies, pure water, sato, namngo, and Kangri-tobo. So those are really what makes Tibet very unique. Those who have been to Tibet know that the depth of color of the sky really takes you away, takes your mind away. So I think we need to, even though we may not be able to visit Tibet, some of us, but we need to have an emotional attachment. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, for 2,000 years, they kept their attachment to the idea of a nation. Through generations and for 2,000 years. Okay? So we need to, find a way to communicate that kind of attachment to every Tibetan. And attachment, Buddhism is a very important part of our heritage, but Buddhism alone is not enough for us to continue our identity. Buddhism is a universal religion. We have a different, unique version of Buddhism, but what will make our identity strong is a combination of strong attachment to the land, some understanding of the uniqueness of who we are as people, and some appreciation of this broad history that has really made us an ancient nation. And if you look at many of the nations in the world, the fact that we have a written language system as early as 7th century, that is pretty impressive. We even had a grammar, Sumjuba and Tangjuba, grammar written in the 7th century for our own language. And if you think about English, modern English grammar is only 16th century. Until that time, the grammars were all about Latin grammar. So these are the things that we need to understand. And the main point I'm trying to make here is, all of you are going to high school, you are going to university, so you have no excuse to say, I don't understand this, okay? Now, if I spoke in classical Tibetan, you can say, oh, it's pyoge takbudu, I don't understand this, then you can leave it. But the fact that I'm saying it in Tibetan, saying it in English, you have no excuse, and you have all the resources, especially these days with the click of a button, with the Wikipedia, with the Googles, and there are just so much resources. If you don't do the work, then it is your own fault, okay? So the main point I'm trying to make is that it is not enough simply to say free Tibet, and say that we are different from Chinese. You need to have some content to the idea of Tibetanness. And that content cannot be defined only in Buddhist terms, okay? Buddhism is a very important part of our heritage, but it needs to have some nationalism element in it. And that, I think, is very important, and I hope that in the discussion that you're going to have after the question and answer, I hope you will take up some of these points, issues of identity, okay? How does Buddhism play into that defining role of identity? And what do you think is important things that we as diaspora Tibetans need to know and communicate? And in the end, even though there will be so many day-to-day needs in India for the city and all the rest, in the end, our struggle, the nature of our struggle, is quite a simple one. It's a struggle for maintaining our narrative. That really is our struggle, making sure that our narrative is clear, truthful, and compelling. Because in the end, the international sort of, activity that we do is really, in the end, it's a sort of a public relations campaign on an international stage. That's what it is. And a public relations campaign on an international stage ultimately won by who has the most compelling narrative. It's not a question of might. And the compelling narrative will come from people who are telling the story, who are compelling, who have confidence, and who have well read their sources and who know who they are. Okay? So I think Tibetans sometimes, Tibetans have this easy-going attitude, and then especially those who grew up in India, we have this chalega, and we get complacent. If we never strive for excellence. We really need to strive for excellence. And sophistication is what we need, curiosity and sophistication, so that any Tibetan, educated Tibetan, when they find an opportunity to tell the story of Tibet, they can tell it with sophistication, with powerful narrative, with conviction. And in order to do that, you got to do the hard work. There's no easy way out, okay? So I wanted to share this with you. And then, of course, part of this is really going to be your mastery of the language. And I know this is where we have one weakness, because the spoken language and the written language is quite far. So many of us can speak Tibetan, but when it comes to writing, and I hope over time the Tibetan writing language will get modernized. I, in fact, wrote a modern grammar, which some are taking seriously, some are criticizing it, but I think we need to find a way to eventually bridge the gap between the spoken Tibetan and the written Tibetan so that the acquisition of writing will become easier. But this is a bigger struggle that the elder generation needs to take seriously. But in the meantime, I think all of you should also make sure that you are conversant in Tibetan, at least the colloquial Tibetan. The reading and writing is a tougher one, especially the writing, because the writing system is still very classical. But the spoken Tibetan, because most of you have parents are both Tibetan and you're interacting with Tibetan, so the language, and also really continue to follow the classes here. And those who are university students, I know it's expensive, but the UVA, University of Virginia, has the best intensive 2-month course. And it's worth every penny. So that's what my younger daughter did this summer. It's really, they teach Tibetan in the way in which you are supposed to teach Tibetan as a second language, as a foreign language. So the teachers UVA is generally known for summer language intensive, but their Tibetan summer language intensive is a really good one. So those who can afford, if you take that 2-month summer language course, it will not only spoken but also written Tibetan will improve immediately. So those are things that I just wanted to share with you, and I'll stop here. Sorry, I was supposed to speak only for 45 minutes, but I got excited. So we'll stop here and take some question and answer, right? Yeah.
Very, very grateful for Geshe Dr. Jimbala's extremely insightful lecture presentation on Tibetan identity and history. With this, we would like to move on with our question and answer session. Given the time constraint, we would not be able to entertain more than 4 or 5 questions, and I would also like to request the participants to keep their questions as brief as they could, and if they could make it to the point question, please. Anyone who'd like to put up question, please? We're open for questions from our participants.
Don't be shy.
Please
okay?
don't be shy.
So this is one of the downsides of Tibetans. We are sometimes not assertive enough. Okay, so and in Tibetan we call it dongzel. We need dongzel. We need assertiveness.
This is our opportunity.
I had a question regarding identity that you spoke about. So I was born in Nepal. My parents were born in Tibet, and I came here in 2005 in grade 7. So in terms of identity, I often ask myself, attempting to sort of define my experiences, because being born in Nepal, being a Tibetan, but also having the sort of influence of the Nepali culture, the Hindi culture, the Bollywood culture, and coming here, it was a lot easier to sort of immerse myself in the Tibetan culture in Nepal, but being here and trying to adapt to the Western culture, I think there's also a challenge to maintain that experience and identity. And so I often ask myself, how can I maintain and pursue the same type of experience that's sort of expected in Nepal, but over here?
Well, thank you. That's a really good question, because the very nature of diaspora life is you're going to be living in a cultural environment where the majority culture is going to be not Tibetan. So that's the very nature of it. So when we talk about Tibetan identity and culture, particularly culture, I don't think we should have a fixed notion of an unchanging culture. That because the cultures always evolve and always change, okay? And every interaction of with another culture is going to change both. So those of us, for example, who grew up in India, I mean, including myself, even though I was a monk for a long time, when it comes to popular culture, my popular culture was Bollywood. So, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about it. Being a Tibetan, having admiration and appreciation of Bollywood culture, we shouldn't be embarrassed about it. That's where we grew up. That is the part of the cultural milieu in which we lived. But on the other hand, when we talk about Tibetan culture and identity, then we need to have some sense of, within this pluralistic society, again, who we are as Tibetans. And that probably includes, of course, some attachment to the idea of Tibet, some attachment to the notion of Tibetanness. Some, especially the majority of the Tibetans are Buddhist, so something to do with the, Buddhist values and heritage. So those things, and then the language. So I think we should not have a idea that there is only one way of being Tibetan. That, I think, is too dogmatic. So for each individual, there may be different shades, but there should be a core part which has to be constant. And that has to do with some attachment to this beautiful land, right now under someone else's control, and some history of that, and important points in the history. And if you are, and particularly if you are religious, then also to have some emotional connection to some of the religious figures, like Padmasambhava or Tsongkhapa, or some of these, and also an appreciation of the key values in your own everyday life. So those are, so it's to cut a long story short, we shouldn't have the idea that there is only one way of being Tibetan. Thank you. You can ask any question. It doesn't have to be related to what I said, okay? Just, yes.
Hi, Tashile, everyone. So I have a question. I like the concept of narratives that you talked about, and I was wondering, since Tibetan culture has been so captured by the Western imaginary, and there's this strong love for the Dalai Lama as a media celebrity and for Tibetan prayer flags and singing bowls and those kinds of Tibetan aesthetics, how do we maintain our narrative amongst this kind of Western fascination with our culture and like Tibet as like this simplistic idea? I don't know how to
like
say
an
that.
exotic world, yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. It's a sort of a fine line because a lot of these appropriation of Tibetan cultural aspects in the majority white culture probably comes from a place of admiration. So I think appropriation that is coming from a place of appreciation, I think we shouldn't be too worried about that because in some sense that sort of keeps the idea, when a Westerner sees a 5-colored prayer flags, they know it's Tibetan. Yeah, I mean most of them, they will know, they will call it Tibetan prayer flags. The singing bowl is the funniest one because singing bowl is not even Tibetan, but it has somehow become Tibetan singing bowl. But the word Tibetan is going to be kept. So I think, those are, but where we need to watch out for is when our more substantive story of who we are is told. Then that, as much as possible, we should learn to own it. And in order to own it ourselves, we need to be articulate. We cannot just simply write partisan pieces like, we are the best kind of thing. So, and then there, I hope among the younger generation of Tibetans here and in the US, hopefully not everyone goes to, practical professions. I hope some of them will go to Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies so that Tibetan history and those things could be written by Tibetans, who have a much deeper, nuanced understanding of our narrative. So I think when it comes to the more substantive narrative, I think we need to pay attention because we don't want a simplistic, narrative, even though it could be well-meaning. Oh, Tibetans are poor, poor thing, they've been occupied, but they're kind of dead, kind of thing, the only thing we can do is to help them protect their culture. Poor thing kind of thing. And that's a defeatist narrative, maybe well-meaning. It's a defeatist narrative. Who are they to say that the story is finished? So those kind of things we have to watch out. But in order to do this, we ourselves need to step up. And this is where I sometimes worry that from younger generation, and it's understandable, there's a practical needs for finding a education that gives you a job at the end. Academic line is unpredictable, but those who have passion, those who are good at it, those who have talent, I don't think should be worried about jobs. I think they should just pursue, particularly in history and cultural studies. I hope more and more Tibetans will do this. Thank you. Yeah. We need the mic.
I can ask any question.
Sure. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, because on the psychology study together, and my goal is to be a neuroscientist. So I know that you have Wangshi and Dokpa, and I've been told usually that Wangshi comes before Dokpa, but there's a gap. And so, like from my psychology understanding, I translate Wangshi kind of like sensation, any sensory input. And then Dokpa would be anything that comes after, like perception. So then my question is, there's a gap between that period, and I'm wondering where the kundonga, I heard about kundonga, and I heard there's this discrimination part, and I'm wondering where kundonga would fit into the gap between Dokpa and Wangshi.
Thank you. I'm very impressed. This is, quite a profound and technical question. I think part of the complication is really coming from trying to correlate two descriptive systems of our cognitive process. So you have the modern cognitive science, which has a way of understanding sensations and perceptions and thoughts and their kind of processes. Then we are bringing the Buddhist perspective, which comes from the Dhammakirti and Dignaga's epistemology, where we have a whole understanding of how the cognitive processes unfold. So now the question you're raising about the pure sensation versus the perception and interpretation, this is, part of the problem is really in the language, the word perception. Because in the Buddhist text, sensations are perceptions. So, they are referred to as pratyaksha, direct perceptions. So that we use the word direct perceptions, and anything that involves interpretations, because the differentiating between pure perception or sensation and thought has to do with any imposition of category. So you have a pure sensation of this object in front of me. The moment I say this is a monk, you have categorized it. So any perceptual processes that involve the bringing in, categories, types, kind, and attributes, then that becomes in the thought and the cognitive processes. So the kundos are concepts coming from the Abhidharma. So that's another complication. And according to Abhidharma psychology, every cognitive process is supposed to have the 5 kundos. So even the pure sensation will have some prototype of 5 kundos, which will involve, for example, like I may not recognize this as a table at the level of pure perception, pure sensation, but there will be edge detections. Okay, so there will be edge detections. There will be a pure sensation will pick out this versus this without imposing categories. It's because there is a boundedness to the objects, and so those will be proto kind of kundos, and even pure sensation is supposed to have a tone. So that's the feeling. The edge detection would be the discriminations. So kundos are you have to sort of even understand a pure sensation level kundos as well. No, they come together.
But how can feeling come at the same time as discrimination?
Because every cognitive process is thought to have a feeling tone with it.
What is feeling tone?
Well, because the thing is, for example, feeling tone is because when an experience arises, it arises either with a sort of a more negative effect, or a positive effect, or a neutral effect. So it's more the kind of underlying tone. No, we can have a separate conversation after, okay?
We're left with only a little amount of time to entertain only one last question.
There's one over there at the back. Japtetu.
Hello.
Hello, Dashle. You had spoken about how we need to have, especially as the younger generation, we need to have a sophisticated knowledge of our history. And I assume you say that also because when we have a better understanding of our history, we understand how complex our history is and how it might actually skew our understanding of the narrative that we have been given, maybe by the government, by our parents, by our, our community. And I wanted to ask, because our gathering is really focused on obviously our language and also our religion, but how do we make space for Tibetans who don't necessarily subscribe to Buddhism, because we do have a long history of Islam in Buddhism as well, and then more recent converts. But then also just the idea of not being like a conventional Tibetan, because that does complicate, our identities are fluid and they are complex as well, just like our histories. But how do we make room for conversations and for those communities, or those diverse parts of our communities, because we are actually very diverse people.
Sure. That's a very good question, actually. That's why I think His Holiness sometimes make a distinction between Buddhism and Buddhist culture. So, in Buddhist culture, for example, he gives the example of the Tibetan Muslims in Lhasa. They are religiously not Buddhist, but they are members of a Buddhist culture because they are participating in these shared values, which is seeped with Buddhist ideas. And for example, like the respect for the life, not killing, and all of this. So I think a distinction can be made. I mean, this is why I think the notion of Tibetanness need not necessarily entail being a Buddhist. Because if we insist, then the idea of Tibetanness necessarily entail, idea of being a Buddhist, then we have a problem. So that's why I say that the Buddhism is an important part of the narrative, but Tibetanness actually goes beyond that, and there needs to be, something that has to do with attachment to a particular land, and history, and ethnicity, and shared experience of that, Tibetan, that people. So for the Buddhist, of course, Buddhism is a very important part of that narrative. But for the non-Buddhist, and Tibet, for example, had the presence of Islam in Lhasa for over 400 years. So it's not just a new thing that is happening now. It was there for a long time. And historically, we had Pompos, in Tibet. They don't see themselves as Nangpas. They call them Buddhists, but they don't call them Chöpas. They don't call themselves Chöpas. And so they have a different narrative when it comes to religion. But then the notion of Tibetanness would still be shared. So I think your point about finding the right balance between the Tibetan identity and the place of Buddhism is a crucial one. Because sometimes in our general narrative, we are too, too simplistic.
Yeah.
And we conflate the two, and being Tibetan becomes being a good Buddhist. So that sort of simplicity needs to be avoided. Yeah?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how mindful we should be in being too Buddhist-centric. Although I know the majority of us are Buddhist.
Sure. Thank you.
We still have time to entertain one last question.
There's one here. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for giving us this insightful speech. So my question is about specifically having a formal education. I think, based on personal experience, it's not really that valid, especially considering the amount of debt a lot of these students will go through. So my question to you is it really something that you need to recommend a lot of these young kids? Maybe they should wait for a longer period of time before they actually invest in something so substantial. So I'm just wondering, is that something?
I didn't catch. What shouldn't we recommend?
The importance of formal education. Like
Formal.
you're saying that it's actually really important that a lot of these kids go through something like that. And I would beg to differ that that's not really something that is... important?
Formal education meaning what? I mean,
Like a university degree or something.
Oh.
Again, it depends on the profession, right? Like it's very contextual.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
my challenge is there's a lot of people out here that they get into a formal education just because their parents want them to do it, just for the sake of it. And after 4 years of investing their time and money, it's not something they really like doing. So like maybe they should have a longer period of time to actually consider what is their strengths, what is their passions before actually getting into a university formal education.
Well, that's actually an important question. I think that is a very general question, though. That's not particularly specific to the Tibetans. And I think one thing that I noticed when I was teaching at Cambridge is the students who have taken a year of gap between high school and university and done something, traveled or volunteered, although they only spend one extra year, the level of maturity and the confidence in what they are doing is very different from students who come straight from high school to university. So I would actually recommend to many students, to think about this seriously. Think of this idea of a gap year. And even if you can't, you could probably stretch your university so that at least you have a half a year during which you do some real volunteer work somewhere in a third world country. That will give you a life experience which probably you're not going to have in future, because once you finish your university, you have the career, you have to go through the process of getting a job and all of this. So I think the university period, first of all, the age is a very important period, and then the experience that you will gain at that time will make a huge difference. So I think what you are asking is not specific to Tibetans. Maybe to some extent, yes, because Tibetan community is still very traditional, and the traditional communities' parents tend to impose a lot of their will. So maybe in that system, it's relevant, but it is a general question, actually. But I would still, even if someone is going to take a gap year, I would still highly recommend that they apply to university, get a place, then negotiate and take a year off. Not postpone applying university, because then once you get into spend a year working, then you may actually lose the edge and start thinking, maybe I don't need to go to university. So that's also a balance. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll conclude our question and session round here. Thank you so much to all the participants for your questions. Thank you for your answers. After this, it's around 11:30. We are breaking out for our tea break, our tea session. We can digest our food of thought and enjoy a hot tea and some refreshment. Right after that, we have round tables of
land, ethnicity, and
At home,
And yeah,
it says to keep our culture so it doesn't disappear. So we're at this point right now, we're talking about how important it is for us, and if we don't keep it together right now.
Hi, being a Tibetan is eating Tibetan food, like momo, shapale, running on Tibetan time. So you want to come 2 hours late to events. Also, being a Tibetan is walking through Jameson and saying touch the lid to 30 different people. Thank you.
Okay. Number one, important because it's our culture. If we don't keep it alive, it will be forgotten. It's our heritage. Otherwise, it will be whitewashed. Okay, number two. Most Tibetan youth don't care enough. It's our own heritage. A mixture of both Western plus Tibetan culture benefits. Okay, number 3, speak it at home. Go Tibetan language classes. Communicate in Tibetan with other friends. Immerse yourself in Tibetan media, news, films, music. Watch Dalai Lama features. Okay.
Hello. So our group talked about how relevant or important Tibetan language is for the younger Tibetan. So basically, through our language, we're able to talk with people, connect with people, and that's how we build relationship, and that's how you know who you are. And it's basically our identity, especially in this era where there's a lot of competing people telling you different ideas about like this is who you should be, this is your values, and like everything that's out there. So it's really hard to be loyal to yourself, loyal to your culture, loyal to your origins. I'm kind of stuttering. Okay. Communication, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and we talked about the... so bad this. Okay, we talked about the... See, I'm trying to come out of my comfort zone here. We talked about the analogy of like there's a treasure in your basement of your home, and you're not even aware about it, and you're just going outside trying to look for treasure in the jungle. You're trying to survive in the jungle, but the treasure is in your basement. So all you have to do is you get your lazy ass down there and try to open that treasure and try to be aware of your surrounding. Basically, connect with your grandparents, connect with your history of your Tibet, stories that are told by your Tibetan. There's always a meaning and value that you can carry. And okay, that's enough of study.
The question that was addressed was what Tibetan identity means to Tibetan youth. We came up with 3 answers regarding this question. The first one was being a fusion of different cultures, including Nepal, India, Tibetan, and Canadian cultures, being this hybrid that we identify ourselves as immigrants, especially immigrants being in exile. A second pointer would be having our name, for instance, Tenzin, Punzo, Thupten, and so forth, just holding that dear to us and having that name almost be like a conversation starter when we are engaging with foreigners and having to say, oh, we're from Tibet. Also, that goes in hand with sharing our narrative and elaborating on how we feel as Tibetans. The third thing that I think a lot of us can relate to is having this, growing up with the compassion, having a nyingje in ourselves. We might not be like necessarily say, oh, dichugure, but having that ingrained into our heads when we were younger, like listening to our parents or, for instance, just watching His Holiness and having this nyingje. I think a lot of us have that in us. So I think that what really means to be a Tibetan youth. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, so our question was, from your perspective, what is the most effective way to preserve and promote Tibetan language? Well, I thought that instead of like doing like a broad like thinking, I was thinking of like doing like preserving it in Toronto. So my answer was to establish new Tibetan classes in the Parkdale neighborhood because there's a lot of Tibetan population there, and that would be the most effective because most Tibetans, they don't want to commute all the way to Etobicoke, like a 1 hour commute, just to like
learn Tibetan and then go home, because that would be really like frustrating, especially on a Sunday. And yeah, that's my answer.
Hi, I'm Yudan. I'm going to be answering question number 1, how relevant or important Tibetan language is for the younger Tibetans. And it's just kind of like a reality check because most Tibetan youth don't find Tibetan language to be as relevant or important as it should be because it's just not part of our custom, everyday life. Because in schools we speak so much English, and like with our friends we also speak English, so it's just like it's not very relevant. But as for importance, I feel like there's a lot of reasons why it should be important for Tibetan youth to preserve our language, because obviously the most important part is preservation. So for like new generations, they will start to lose the language if we don't find it important to preserve our language, as well as just to feel acceptance and fit into the Tibetan community. And this ties into our identity crisis. So when people ask us who and what we identify as, our first response should be Tibetan, because that's who we are. And like the Tibetan language is a huge part of being Tibetan. So yeah, that just stresses the importance of preserving Tibetan language for the younger Tibetans especially. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. So my name is Tenzin Digi, and our question for the question for our group was, what does the Tibetan identity mean to the current Tibetan youth? And we as a group agreed that it meant to follow our religion, speak Tibetan at home, and our Tibetan values like showing compassion, being kind, and what I personally thought was what made our Tibetan identity for the current youth was the Tibetan performance, the yoga that we do in TCC, because to be honest, most of the Tibetan youth here, they're like kind of forced to follow the Tibetan religion. Like I don't think like most of the youth understand like the real meaning of all the shindu that we do. And then the Tibetan speaking thing is like mostly forced on by the Tibetan parents and also the adults. But what I think like the kids most enjoy the most are the dances, the traditional dresses that we wear, and also the foods that we eat. Like I know we all like momos, shaman, you know, so I think that's what makes up our Tibetan identity for the current youth at least. Thank you.
Hi, Tashle, everyone. So my team, in terms of the first question, we kind of established that Tibetan language is key to maintaining culture, and it's important to transmit it to children because learning it retroactively is very difficult, and so much of identity is embedded in the language itself. But then again, I'm a Tibetan with a really bad Tibetan, so like this is kind of a hypocritical stance to have, but also like, yeah, and then in terms of the second question, we kind of asked ourselves, what does it mean to be Tibetan today? And we kind of started out from the point of, well, coming from Tibet itself. And then we went deeper, we went, well, our children won't come from Tibet. Well, they're still Tibetan. So overall, what we came to like establish as Tibetan is something that comes from family. And it's Tibetan identity is a source of pride, source of community. And lastly, once again, the theme of family emerged in terms of the most effective way to promote Tibetan language is through holidays, through understanding our own family history and like how it plays into the overall broad Tibetan history and situating where we fit in all that. And also Sunday school is important So yeah, overall, we just talked about family, community as source of identity and stability. Yeah, thanks.
And give us a meaningful sort of conclusion for the first session of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think I'm going to stand up so that others on the back can see me. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts, and I'm very impressed. Each one of you represented your group well, and it seems the conversation has been a rich one. Also, a lot of consensus on the broad suggestions that you really arrived at. When it comes to the first question, the relevance of Tibetan language for younger generation of Tibetans, I think the key point that language is in some sense the medium for the culture. So although the culture is a broader concept, as someone pointed out, it's true, language is a subset of that culture, but on the other hand, Tibetan language is really the medium for that culture. So the relationship between culture and language, and the culture preservation and the language preservation are very intimately connected. So I don't think we can completely separate the two. I know learning Tibetan in the West is a struggle. For those whose parents are both Tibetans, you're fortunate. I hope your parents spoke Tibetan to you when you were kids. I do notice now that there is a new trend, which is a little unfortunate, that even though both parents are Tibetans, I've seen often they speak to their children in English, which is a real tragedy, particularly when you're living in a cultural environment, society where the outside language is English. You don't have to worry about your children's acquisition of English, because entertainments are going to be in English, school language is going to be English, the peers are going to speak English. So it is not your job to teach your kid English. English is going to come. I mean, if you look at parents of mixed races, you can see, in fact, you imagine you have a Tibetan father, French, English-speaking mother, and living in France. It's doable to have 3 languages. Father speaks in the Tibetan, mother speaks in English, school speaks French. So in a mono-language cultural environment like Toronto, there's just no justification and excuse for parents for speaking English only to their kids. It's just simply no justification other than pure laziness. Okay, so I think this is something that is really important, because I know parents worry about their children not being able to communicate. Once they start going to daycare, they will pick up English. The moment they open the TV, it's all in English. So I think that it's very important, because this important theme came up, and it's sort of the first question and the third question are kind of very closely connected. The relevance of language for the Tibetan youth and how to preserve language, they're very intimately connected. So all of you are going to be at some point parents. Please remember this. In my case, I have 2 girls. We live in Montreal, which is a French-speaking. So then there needs to be English. So then a third language was a complicated one, having 3 languages. So now they are catching up. Sometimes they criticize me. They say, "Why didn't you teach me Tibetan?" Which is not that easy, but now they're catching up. So I think it would be easier if the parents had spoken Tibetan right from the beginning. And spoken language, if the children are very small, they will pick it up very easily, because children have the capacity to pick up to 4 or 5 languages, especially 2 languages fluently. There are a lot of studies that shows that children who are bilingual actually have both languages as part of their mother tongue. The mother tongue is spoken from the left brain. Acquired second language is spoken for the right brain. So in my case, I learned English much later. So when I get tired, then I struggle with words. So that shows that it is, even though I speak rather fluently, but it's not as fluent as a mother tongue. So whereas if you speak to children before age of 4, they will acquire it as if it's a mother tongue. So I think language, we need to make a distinction between acquisition of written language and spoken language. Being able to teach children how to write, that is a challenge. This is a very difficult one in our case, because in English, how you write it is very close to how you say it. It's very close. So if you learn to speak English well, you also learn to speak, you also learn to write well quite easily. In Tibetan, it's more complicated. We have sango rangos and, which are silent, which does modify, because nga, sangaptang, when you put the superscript, it becomes nga. It modifies the sound, but there's no hint of S anywhere. We have ngunju. Ngunju still modifies. So if you look at the chart, ka 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 nga, cha cha chanya, ta 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 na, pa 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 ma, and it's when you learn ka 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 nga, it's important to not write all the way like this. It's important to write in columns, because the first letters, ka, cha, ta, pa, za, they're all very high. They never get modified. They never get modified. The sound remains exactly the same. Then the second column, ka, cha, ta, pa, za, they never get modified. They remain exactly the same. It is the third column, ka, cha, ta, pa. Za is different, but ka, cha, ta, pa, that gets modified. Ka becomes ga, cha becomes ja, ta becomes da, and then pa becomes, with the ngunju, it becomes wa, ta wa, and sango rango, it becomes ba. So because ba is not represented in Tibetan, so we have to create it by constructing. And then when you put the ratas, again, it's not in the consonant, but we have to create that sound. So in order to create that sound, you put a semi-vowel. So ratas are semi-vowels, yatas are semi-vowels, and semi-vowels sound will be contained. So you say payata cha. So the yata modifies the sound of pa because it is semi-vowel. So the Tibetan writing system is complicated, but there is a system, there is a trick in which you can learn it so that you know how the sound. So in any case, the point I'm trying to make is the parents' responsibility is to really teach the spoken language. Written language has to be taught in some, Sunday classes, and also, it's easier to learn how to read, but it's quite difficult to learn how to write. Because the Tibetan, the grammar system is complicated. The Tibetan grammar is borrowed from Sanskrit and imposed on Tibetan. So that has a mismatch. And then all the ngunjus and sangurangos, make a difference to the spelling. So, hair, ta, is the same as tashi. Sound is the same, exactly the same. Tehor, tiu, monkeys, they have exactly the same sound, but written differently. So this is part of the problem of Tibetan, and that is a problem that needs to be handled separately. And hopefully, at some point, we will have some clever linguists among Tibetans who will map out, find a key to say, okay, all of these categories is spelled like this, all of this category is spelled like this. So then children will just have to memorize a set of words. I hope so, because the Chinese, this is how they do. Chinese children have to learn several thousand, words, characters by heart. And once they learn those thousands of characters by heart, they can write. So in Tibetan, at some point, and I just hope, like Shirik department, education department in India would actually set up a whole committee, do a research, Make it easy so that children at this age, you learn this many words by heart. You learn this many verbs by heart. Then we know by age this, you learn this many words. Age by that, we learn this many words. This is a work that needs to be done by scholars, committees, and parents can't do this. And it's unrealistic to expect parents to be able to teach children growing up in the West how to write Tibetan. But the parents should be expected to teach how the Tibetans to speak Tibetan, because spoken Tibetan is easy like any other language. Okay? And also Tibetan grammar is quite simple. If you learn it in the spoken one, we don't modify the verb according to, tenses. We have the modification, but most of the verb changes remain pretty simple. The Tibetan spoken language itself is quite simple. The structure is simple. You have a subject, you have verb at the end, and everything in between. It's basically, the sentence structure is pretty simple. Okay, it's not that complicated. So spoken Tibetan is easy to teach. So I think, and then someone suggested, among the entertainment, to have more material for children. I think that's, again, a very important one, but it's a challenge. You need to have resources. Financially, it is not going to be viable. And unfortunately, many Tibetans don't pay. For example, like, what is his name? The singer, Phuphuti Namgyel. Phuphuti Namgyel's songs are very popular, but very few people actually buy the CD, they just copy. So creating entertainment, again, it's a good idea, unless you have some system, like in CTA, Education Department, or something that would be funding these things. Again, it is a challenge. It's not really practical, and you can't expect, individuals to be doing it day in and day out purely on a voluntary basis. But I think it's a good idea. One thing that those who are learning how to write, that is really helpful, and particularly the classical Tibetan, to listen to His Holiness's not just teachings, his public talks, Tibetan galops. His galops, many of them are now transcribed, and His Holiness speaks one of the most beautiful Tibetan. And it's classical vocabulary, but the sentence structure and the grammatical structure is fluid, not just
Ja, ja. Det är det.
for the day. Dr. Thupten Jinpa will now speak on and present on unique features of Buddhism and the Tibetan tradition for next 45 minutes to an hour.
Welcome back. I'm going to continue in English again. But during the question and answer session, among the students, if there are some who feel confident to ask questions in Tibetan, please do, okay? Now, this afternoon is more focused on Buddhism, and particularly the unique features of it, and also the Tibetan tradition. This morning, we already had some discussions, conversations about the place of Buddhism within the overall conception of Tibetanness. Buddhism first came to Tibet in the 7th century, although Tibetan historians would say that some of the texts came as early as in the 4th century. For example, Yumbulagar is the first fortress built in the 4th century, and during that king, Latoturi Nyenzen, there are stories, some of them are legendary, where scriptures are supposed to come down from, fallen down from skies, from clouds. Whatever may be the case, probably the chances are the real story is that some text may have ended up in Tibet. And Latoturi Nyenzen is said to have a dream in which it says that in 12 generations, the meaning of this text will be revealed. So that was the 7th century Songtsen Gampo. In any case, as I mentioned in my morning presentation, 7th century is really the time when Buddhism formally got established in Tibet, with the building of Lhasa Chogang, installation of, there were 2 very important statues in Tibet, in fact 3 actually. One is the statue of the Buddha brought by Princess Wencheng as her dowry gift to Emperor Songtsen Gampo, which was originally housed in Ramoche temple and which was subsequently moved to Lhasa Chogang. There was another statue of the Buddha brought by the Nepalese princess, which was initially installed in Chogang, which then got moved back to Ramoche. So today, later the placement of these 2 statues was switched. Another important statue in Lhasa Chogang is the Chenresig statue, which is known as the Rangjo Ngaden. And this is a statue of Avalokiteshvara, which has another statue at its heart. So there are 2 statues. And then on top of that, according to the legend, when Songtsen Gampo died, he's supposed to have dissolved into the statue, and his 2 princesses, queens, are also said to have dissolved. So that's what makes the statue 5-faceted, Rangchun Ngaden. Rangchun means self-arisen. It was not made by a human being. So in any case, those important statues really came to Tibet in the 7th century, and that's when the formal Buddhism began. The more systematic attempt at really institutionalizing Buddhism really came in the 8th century with Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, and Shantarakshita coming in, bringing the monastic tradition, philosophical, teaching, a systematic translation of many of the Buddhist texts, which eventually became, compiled as Kangyuru and Tengyuru. So the actual compilation is in the 13th, 14th century, but the texts that were translated mainly in the 7th to the 9th century period. Okay, and they are later put together in 2 canonical collections. One is called Kangyuru. Kangyuru means literally translations of scriptures. the Buddha's words. Ka Gyur. Gyur is translations. Ka Gyur means translations of Buddha's words. And the second collection is known as Tengyur. Tengyur literally means translations of treatises. Ten refers to Tenju. Tenju is Shastras. So these are philosophical and important religious texts written by great Indian masters. So you have Tibetans have two canonical collections. I don't know if they're here, but they were somewhere in the main prayer hall. You have Kangyur in one section and Tengyur. So those systematic translations began in this, from the 8th century onwards. And over time, Buddhism really came to be established. And Tibetan language, the written system was almost designed specifically to bring this new teaching from India. And that's one of the reasons why Tibetan translations of Sanskrit texts are very highly valued, because they are very accurate, unlike the translation into Chinese. Because by the time Buddhism came to China, China already had a long history of written language-based sophisticated philosophical culture, which meant when new texts were being brought in, the terminology had to fit into an already existing worldview and philosophical terminology. So Chinese Buddhist texts had to adapt their terminology, whereas in Buddhism, when it came to Tibet, we did not have a writing system-based culture, although there is an alternative view coming from the Bon tradition, which makes the case that at least in the Shangshung area, which is in Western Tibet, there was a writing system. That's still open to question. There's some scholars maintain that the actual writing system was based on a Shangshung text, script that existed before. But at this point, we don't have any archaeological evidence that points to the existence of a written language system prior to the 7th century. So it's an open question. I know some Tibetan scholars who are more nationalistic would like to argue that there was an indigenous writing system before the Indian script was brought in, but so far, no evidence. There's no carvings on the rocks, no scripts written on the bones, because in the old, ancient cultures and traditions and places, in the past they were writing things on slates and inscribing things on the wall, and if there was such a thing, we should be finding it, but maybe it will turn up. But at this point, it's an open question. So we will, I for one, accept that as far as the current writing system is concerned, it's 7th century. So anyway, the 7th century writing system and the grammar was brought from India, and the language was almost designed to bring, Indian Buddhist concepts. So that's why, almost all the words in Sanskrit were translated into Tibetan, except for a few words like lotus, pema, because there was no lotus in Tibet. So Padma is the Sanskrit word, and in order to make it easier for the Tibetans, we call it Pema. We don't say Padma. And Singhi, there were no lions in Tibet, although we have 2 lions on our national flag, but those are mythological creatures, not real animals. So there were no lions in Tibet. Lions existed in India. So the Tibetan word Singhi is actually modified word of Sanskrit word Sinha. And because Sinha is not close to Tibetan, so we changed it. So in fact, there is a 9th century text, which is, late 8th century, early 9th century text called Dajru Pambunyiba, which is an amazing piece of writing as early as that period, which explains the translation theory and practice. When we bring Sanskrit text into Tibetan, and how, there are certain words like lotus, pema and singhi, which should not be translated because they don't exist in Tibet. So then you might as well use the original term, but when you use the original term, it should be modified so that it's easier for the Tibetan tongue. So those are very impressive thinking behind all of this. So these are great, innovative Tibetan kind of, approach to bringing translations. So the translation took place over a long period of time, and by the end of the 8th century, thanks to Shantarakshita, already many of the philosophical literature was translated into Tibetan. Shantarakshita himself was a great Indian philosopher, not just of Buddhism, but in fact of general Indian systems of thought. His main text, called Tattva Samgaraha, which is still available in Sanskrit, and in fact not just Buddhist, but in fact non-Buddhist Indian traditions also highly value that text as an encyclopedia of Indian philosophy. So this was the master who came to Tibet, and his student Shantarakshita came to Tibet. At that time, there was a competition for dominance between two forms of Buddhism in Tibet, Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism, because Tibetan Empire had connections with China, Central Asia. There were Chinese Hashang monks coming into Tibet, and then you have the Indians coming in. Then, of course, you're among the ruling elite, the members of the royal family and the other powerful, ministers' families. Some of them were going with the Chinese side, some of them were going with the Indian side. Human beings are human beings, There's going to be competition. So finally, King Trisong Dezen staged the very famous Samya debate, where he basically invited the two sides together and, allowed them to engage in a series of debates, and whoever wins is going to be basically dictating the version of Buddhism that is going to be the official in Tibet. So at the end of these debates, the Indian side is supposed to have won, and then the Chinese Hashang and his students were asked to leave. And since then, and in fact we have a text that shows how immediately after the king issues a decree, he says, from now on, our version of Buddhism will be the following. The philosophical view will be that of Nagarjuna, and then the practices will be that of Mahayana Buddhism, 6 perfections. He actually sets out and that's when Buddhism became the official Tibetan state religion. So that was in the 8th century. And so to cut a long story short, it is thanks to this particular debate and the Indian side, sort of winning the day, which really defined the Tibetan tradition. And this is why His Holiness always reminds us the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is the Nalanda tradition. And the Nalanda tradition, what is the unique feature of Nalanda tradition is the emphasis on reason, not just faith. And emphasis on reason and practice of the Dharma based on understanding, grounded in the study of the great classics. So that really is the Nalanda approach. So the Nalanda approach does not emphasize devotion alone. And so if you now compare the Chinese tradition versus the Tibetan tradition, the Chinese tradition tend to be much more devotional. Worshipping Amitabha is a very important part of the focus. Chanting is a very important part of the focus. Even when they read scriptures, they tend to emphasize the sutras, the Buddha's words, not so much the shastras, the philosophical treatises. The Tibetan tradition is very different. Tibetan tradition, of course, emphasize devotion to the Buddha, taking refuge in all the rest. But when it comes to understanding the path to enlightenment, Tibetan tradition insists on the individual understanding the text, understanding the practice, and study. So, and this is the system that was established in the 8th century, and since then it became the norm. Now, from this evolved the entire Tibetan tradition. Of course, today when we talk about Tibetan tradition, we talk about, Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, Gelug, and Chonang. But those labels, those different, schools were later inventions. When Buddhism first came to Tibet in the 6th century, 7th century, established in the 8th century, there was no Nyingma Sakya Kagyu Geluk. Okay? So basically it was Buddhism, Indian Buddhism. Now, with the Lang Dharma and the collapse of the empire, Central Empire, then Tibet became splintered. Then there were many different kingdoms. And then during this period, there was a decline of Buddhism. Very few monks were seen in Central Tibet. According to one estimate, it took almost 80 years before a monk was seen. So there were very few monks there, and the monastic establishment got declined. But to cut a long story short, in the middle of 11th century, so 10-something, Buddhism started getting revived in Tibet, and it began from Western Tibet and from Amdo as well. The monastic tradition revival came from Amdo area to Central Tibet, and the main sort of revival came from Western Tibet thanks to Atisha. So in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, Atisha, the Indian master from Bengal, is a very important figure. And Atisha's activity, he was in Tibet for nearly 13 years. Atisha's activities in Tibet led to the emergence of what is the first self-consciously identified school, Kadampas. Okay, Kadampas were the first self-consciously identified school. They were the followers of Atisha's teaching and his Tibetan spiritual heir, Thupten Jinpa. And then the term Nyingmapa came into being because Nyingma means the old, and when you call something old, there has to be something new, because otherwise you cannot call something old. So all the traditions that came with Atisha and after Atisha are referred to as the Sarma, the new school. And those members who continue to have greater loyalty and allegiance to the imperial period Buddhism, period before Atisha, they came to be referred to as the Nyingmapas. Okay, so this is, and in the Tibetan tradition, when we talk about these four major traditions, the distinctions are not really about doctrinal issues. It's really more about allegiances and loyalty to a transmission, a lineage. Nyingmapas, the followers of Nyingma tradition, owe primary allegiance to the early Buddhism that came to Tibet, especially the teachings of Padmasambhava. So it's more a question of lineage and in loyalty to a particular lineage. Kadampas were the ones who have deeper allegiance to Atisha and Thupten Jinpa and their teachings. Sakya tradition owes primary allegiance to a particular lineage that comes from Drongmi Lotsawa and Sakya masters. So this is Lamdre and He Vajra Tantra. And then the Kagyu tradition came primarily through the allegiance belonging to the lineage of Marpa, Milarepa, and so on. And then the newest school is Gelug. Gelug is a kind of a new version of Kadampa and owes great primary allegiance to the teachings of Tsongkhapa. So the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism has more to do with transmission and lineage rather than different doctrinal positions. And all the four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism share common kind of, allegiance to the Indian tradition, the Nalanda tradition. Okay? So that, I think, is a broad understanding of, Tibetan tradition, because sometimes the younger generation of Tibetan, when they're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, then they say, okay, where do I start? There's this thing, there's that thing, there's this thing. Where does Lamrim fit in? So I think it's helpful to have the big picture. Once you have a big picture, then you understand. And then you also need to understand what are the main contributions of some of the key figures, on your individual level, whether you see yourself as a Gelugpa or a Sakyapa or a Nyingmapa and so on. For the younger generation, it's not really an issue. For the elder generation, it may be an issue. But for the younger generation, it's not really an issue. We're now living in a much more integrated Tibetan community where you have access to all the traditions. And this is why, following His Holiness's vision is a really good one, which is basically when he gives teachings, he presents the shared common Tibetan tradition which comes from India. And that, I think, is really a good way of relating to the teachings. So, what is important as Tibetans, regardless of whether your parents are Sakyapa or Nyingmapa or Kagyupa or Gelugpa, as a Tibetan, educated young Tibetan, taking interest in Buddhism, what is important is to at least have some idea of the key figures, individuals. So I spoke about Shantarakshita, I spoke about Padmasambhava, I spoke about Kamalashila. Then you have major figures like Ngolonten Sherab. Ngolonten Sherab was late 11th, early 12th century Tibetan thinker who spent a lot of time in India and Kashmir studying Sanskrit. He, from a Tibetan historical point of view, what makes him unique is that he is the founder of Tibetan scholastic tradition. The study of the great classics in Tibet, systematic study, is really Ngolonten Sherab. And he also invented a very important system that the Tibetans are very good at, which is a template system. So when Tibetans, some of you, if you're working in modern setting, sometimes when you do PowerPoints, you do outlines, and then from the outlines you go deeper into different levels of category. This is called the subject system in Tibetan. And it was Ngolonten Sherab who invented that. So many of the Tibetan texts has this very impressive outline system that goes into different levels of depth. So Ngolonten Sherab is one important figure that individuals need to know, because he really is the father of Tibetan scholastic tradition. Another person that we need to know is Chapa Chögyesenge. He is late 12th century. He is the one who started the debate, invented the Tibetan debate tradition. And Tibetan debate tradition, although is based on Nalanda Buddhist texts and logic and epistemology, but the form itself is uniquely Tibetan. And it uses various Tibetan terminology, style of debating, and many of you would have seen monks debating in the courtyard with all the kind of boisterous physical posture, shouting, jumping. This is Chapa Chögyesenge. And he was a genius. And in fact, there is even some Western thinkers believe that when it comes to systematic definition of definition itself, Chapa Chögyesenge may have been the first person in the world to write about it. So Chapa is another intellectual giant that you need to know. And another important person is Sakya Pandita. For late 13th century, early 13th century. Sakya Pandita is the one who really changed Tibetan high culture, poetry, literary tradition. And also, he was very innovative. He, in fact, wrote even a treatise on music, a formal treatise on music. He was the one who brought to Tibet and invented the Lekshe literature. Some of you might have known Sakya Lekshe. Have you heard of Sakya Lekshe? Sakya Lekshe, those are things I think the teachers need to teach actually in the Sunday classes once in a while. Some teachers are here. I would really appeal to you respectfully. few words from Sajja Lekshe. In the old days, every educated Tibetan would know many verses from Sajja Lekshe. Sajja Lekshe is a really beautiful text, and it's modeled on Indian Niti Shastra, such as Panchatantra. You have heard of Panchatantra. Panchatantra is the famous Indian animal story book, where within a story there's a moral, and it's a sort of a particular pedagogical method in classical India, which was used to train the princesses and children of the high ministers, was through telling of stories. So Sajja Pandita brought this literature into Tibet and wrote the first text called Sajja Lekshe, which then opened up a whole genre of writing called Chui Tenje, treatise on water, treatise on trees, and so on. Sajja Lekshe, Sajja Pandita also brought Indian Sanskrit poetry into Tibet. Today's beautiful poetry writing was brought to Tibet by Sajja Pandita using Sanskrit poetics. And, Sanskrit poetics is very sophisticated and a main emphasis on learning how to use metaphors. And there are actually over 30 different ways in which systematically you can use the metaphor differently. So it's called Töngen or Pegen. Sajja Pandita is the one that brought it in. And Sajja Pandita finally is the one who systematized the knowledge discipline division of Ringne Chewanga and Chungwanga. Okay, so 5 major fields of knowledge and 5 minor fields of knowledge. So this is Sajja Pandita who formally introduced the systematic training of this in Tibet. So if there is one person who is the most important figure in the entire history of classical Tibetan knowledge, it has to be Sajja Pandita. He's that important. So if you guys are Tibetan and interested in Tibetan culture, Tibetan history, and Tibetan philosophy, and if you don't know who Sajja Pandita is, there's a big gap in your knowledge, okay? And this is partly our own fault, because the Tibetan exile community also have not been sophisticated enough to develop pedagogy material that would make these important figures come to life. Whereas in the West, every high school student will know who Shakespeare is. Okay? Most high school students will know who Mozart is, because they are so important cultural figures in Western cultural imagination that everybody will kind of know who they are, broadly, not necessarily, completely. But in Tibetan, we have failed to find a way to communicate to our younger generation to say who the major cultural icons are. We have Buddha, we have the great Dalai Lamas, but beyond that, when it comes to culture, on religion maybe we can say a few words, a few people, but when it comes to culture, we really don't have. So I think it's important to have some understanding, who these figures are. Then of course you have Longchenpa, who was the great, the greatest writer in the Nyingma tradition. And then Gampopa was the founder of the Kagyu tradition. Many of you probably know the story of Milarepa because it's an exciting story. There's a drama there. So these are important cultural figures that, those who are interested in Tibetan tradition needs to know. Now, while we know these stories, which is important because they are the ones who make the idea of Tibetan Buddhism real, because otherwise it becomes abstract. It becomes a list. And you don't want your understanding of Tibetan tradition just reduced to a list. You want some flesh and bones to that imagination, who these great beings were. So I think it's important, and those who are interested, fortunately the new material is coming. Shambhala is publishing a series called Tibetan Masters, and these are deliberately being written in a non-academic way for the benefit of general readership. So I think you should watch out for it. I'm about to submit my manuscript on the life of Tsongkhapa, which is going to be published next year, because next year is the 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's Nirvana. So I think more and more of this literature is going to come out, and I think it is important that, and when you read a biography, it's also not that difficult, you know, because there's a story, there's a person behind it. So it is important to have that kind of, you know, understanding. Now, with respect to studying Buddhism itself, His Holiness really wishes that his Tibetan community, particularly the younger generation, the educated ones, find a way to engage with Buddhism in an intelligent, informed, educated way. So what does that mean? That means being able to do some study, okay? So you can choose to study, first have a very general introduction to Buddhism, and then maybe you should choose a text, like there are now beautiful translations of Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara. So you can choose a text like an English translation of Shantideva and systematically study it. And one of the things that he has suggested is that Tibetan community members form reading groups and look at a text and bring up questions and discuss. So this is what he means by relating. And one of the things that he really wish the Tibetan community will pick up is a series of 4 books that His Holiness has envisioned, and you know, which is being done by a team of scholars. And these are known as Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. The Tibetan version of the 2 volumes are already out. There were 2 on science, 1 on physical science and 1 on mind science are already out. This is the first volume of the English. The second volume is going to come out soon. Volume 3 and 4 are on philosophy. The Tibetan version is being finalized, and then the translations will come out. So these are specially designed for educated readers who need not have formal background in monastic training, but who are interested, who are willing to spend some time, and who are willing to put some effort, and has the intellectual capacity to do so, to be able to really go through the key topics in a systematic way. So this particular one is on the Buddhist conception of material world, you know, and it includes also some basics of Buddhist methodology of how, when the Buddhist, from a Buddhist point of view, when we try to understand the physical world, what kind of methodology we use. So I'm going to leave this copy here for the association. I'm sure Association Library has one. And the paperback has just come out in India, which is very affordable. I think it's really worth, I mean, you may not be able to read it cover to cover because a lot of the texts are direct quotation from classical texts which are translated, but there are introductions and essays which go with them, which will really, you know, give you a sense of the importance. So I think, to conclude, what I want to say is to really underline the aspiration that His Holiness has, that, you know, I mean, I remember quite recently at one of the interviews, a question was asked about the long-term survival of Buddhism in this modern age, the digital age, and His Holiness gave a very, very powerful response. And he said that if the Buddhist community continues to engage with their dharma, their tradition, purely on the basis of devotion, he said, I'm not quite sure how long it will last. But on the other hand, if the traditional Buddhist community find a way to engage with their Buddhist faith in a much more educated, reason-based, you know, way, then Buddhism will remain for centuries to come. That, I think, is a powerful wisdom, and this is what he wishes for us Tibetans. And at the end of the day, His Holiness has always reminded us that those who are able to learn something from Buddhism themselves, apply it in their daily life, they themselves stand to gain. Because in your day-to-day life, you will have more resources to deal with stress. You will have a better worldview, because in the end, your worldview matters. You know, how you see the world. If you see the world as dangerous, everybody's out there to screw you, you know, then of course, you're going to live in the world out of terror and suspicion and fear. Whereas if you generally have a disposition that says, okay, all people have basic compassionate nature, everybody will try hard, sometimes there may be difficulties, but then that's life. That kind of perception of the world completely changes the way you live. You may be living in exactly the same environment, two different people with two different views experiences the world differently. And this is where Buddhism is really powerful. In my own day-to-day life, I end up leading a life that is pretty busy. You know, I travel a lot, and I'm connected with all sorts of sort of work, Stanford, Mind Alive, McGill, my own classics text work, and then some work in India. There's a lot of, and I interact with many different people, and when I bring a simple kind of clear attitude, you know, I don't find much stress, because in the end, why be afraid? You know, everybody's like me. I know at the end of the day, everybody wants to be happy. You know, nobody wants to have problem. Those are very simple, basic ideas which really make a difference. And the Lojong teachings, and this is where I think the younger generation, if you take, there's a particular genre of text called Lojong, mind training. Actually, Wisdom has produced a paperback version called Essential Mind Training. The beauty of Lojong is Lojong makes practical the insights and the wisdom of Buddhism that you can apply on a daily basis. That when you are confronted with challenges, difficulties, when you're dealing with difficult people, all of this, Lojong really teaches you how to maintain your resilience, how to maintain your optimism. And in the end, you know, while you are seeking to the path to enlightenment on a day-to-day life, if you can also live a happier life, you stand to gain. And everybody wants that. So I think, you know, although there is a powerful argument that the younger generation of Tibetans should take Buddhism seriously because it is part of our heritage, which is a broader cultural argument, the most compelling argument in the end is it's beneficial to you. You're the first one to gain benefit from your understanding and experience of Buddhism. And that is, in a sense, the most powerful argument. Because one of the things that the West, the modern West, is struggling with is how to give individuals a sense of purpose and a meaning in a world that is secularized, a world that is pluralistic. Now, people sometimes, because of that, go to extreme form of religion, fanaticism. Some go to the other extreme of not taking any interest in spirituality and being completely materialistic. But Buddhism offers this beautiful middle way where you are not dogmatic religious, but you also are deeply spiritual, and where you have a sense of purpose and a meaning that makes your life, you know, meaningful and rich. And this is where the power of Buddhism comes in. You know, I think for me, personally, the most compelling argument is you should take Buddhism seriously because you stand to gain. And on top of that, of course, if we care about the survival of Tibetan cause and Tibetan culture and language and so on, then taking interest in Buddhism has also another dimension. So that's what I wanted to share. So maybe we can have some question and answers. Yeah. Let's. Machine di tanda di the Ningu Yuan di ya Nangju Kolin za 인지 차상마히니 돈달게 벽에 난 도르두지에 지카시 슈 다는디 다 인공연 다는 낭주 등에 자외 모두 슈에디 낭주 통만 별 간데슬레 말레다 라버도 별 나로야 직 경험 제 까낭 반나신 게 벽의 낭주디 날렌데 아니 추규레스 까낭게 요래 날렌데 추규 투모 많이 봐다 간다직 넘버 타고 지 레스 까낭 고에디 별이야 유럽 구베 나로 개베 나로야 디두 신에 아니 간다직 자나네 용베 낭주다 자가네 용베 낭주니 보루리야 직 덴두르 지여베 인자 간다 주제 주선 대상 갑리야 아니 사메야 저버저제 저버저로 주네 아니 자의 하상게 초지다 순항원데 자가게 개바 까말라실라 샨다라시다 시워서 로마 까말라실레 초 로마다 제와 간다 텐디제 아니 저버저로 주네 판돔러버데 아니 까말라실레 초데 개가 톱제 되네 손에 아니 벽에 낭줘디 자가가 낭줘디 제고레스 아니 따와 차샤버는 공부를 주고 따와 제 저봐 바로도 전부 투제 태과 진보를 냠래 상하다 제부터 지긴시 땜베비 제네 가다 자가게 낭주 지마치지 별래 아니 샹다라시다 쿠란 가다 자가게 떠주마와 개바 진보를 낭배 개바 좀 마세베 참아르베 개바래 쿠란 같은 태고는 유튜브 차샤버는 다대 두줄에 자가 개바도 로종 제다 제신벌에 딘레기 간다 지 남주쟁기 벤트다 전부지 별 폐제 별 나로야 흉침묘 롭종제 시럽지 띵낭 말아 아니 디는장에 내가 지주지 슈모조 가르슈베나 지단 벽의 추규 나로야 사자 닝마 가주게 루스제 조나다 제바 셰수여도 요래때 이내 즉 슈모조게 파모조 추규 출루 가르 이내 매네 슈모조고네 벽 집에 돈에 낭바 먼저 벽 가다 즉 벽유 낭대에서 삼을 땅 토변에 하고요. 다디 삼을 땅 벌려야 아니 로규기 차네 벽유 낭대리야 간다 그린 체쇼게 제제제기 아니 개버 수이 마인데 메카시제 원진체도나 하고요. 그래서 베나샤샤베나 ngolonde 샤랍기 간다 벽에 흉첨모 데바좀이야게 우츠브레 흉 간다 땡조 좀베칼라 subject 하면데 ngolonde 샤랍게 서브레 두즈르데 제제침브레 차바추게 생기기 딱세 당해야돼 신이리버데 벽에 랑거 돌이야 쉐바 축구 용해야돼 차바추게 생기 서브레 되는신 잠군 사변 차샤베는 다 벽이 체도 리넬이야 까딘 체쇼 차데 요르 리네 체왕가다 총왕가 세데 잠군 사변게 벽이야 때문에 남겨래 자간에서 냥아 멜로메 룩수기 냥아 세토부자게 수별 베니데 잠군 사변레 다다디 자가기 루기 땡줄이야 벨란제 사제ben데 사제렉시에 좀제 변나로야 렉시에 땡주 추다 신게 땡주다 망부 다래야데 랑가 고친인 사제ben데레 참마르베 톨차샤베나 참마르들 좀제 간다 벽 간다 초 총놈자제 현다 파샤나니 로메 땡주지다 사변게 좀제 변나로야다 간다 지금 로모 야가가 나타샤스트라세데 대화가 흉리야 빼자제 로메 땡주 되게도 좀제 다 벽 나로야 벽에 그 나로야 르시운 새 토보기 갖다지 디 르시운 새 토보 중앙에 갖다 이거 때문에 그 르시운 새 토보 용에게 소년직도 장군 사변 자교래 먼저 갖다 벽에 인생에서 장군 사변 수를 슬랍도 갈 때듯이 모신 거 봐서 수주 사제 이만 이게 제 말다 수주 사제가 이만 이게 제 건데고 그래요 말 근데 벽에 임배잖아요 잠군 사변 슬랍도 갈 로로지 차주 버시 야 디제제 데려다 삼삼시 눈주지 내 바로 고두스 괜찮은 노조기 베나 딩림 라브라다 튼 사년지 차샤에베나 망치기 셰익스피어 소레스 람나 모신 거와 그 내가 좀 리버 깨라침부래 모차르트 소레스 람나 데 간다 로모 개바침부인들갈 간다 노조고 지조 리숑이야 제제제게 밉드즈리데 갈간담지 드림로로 튼디고 모신게 여러와 먼저 배워줘 내가 중이 튼 콜리지 템베네 나라저 벽이 그 수윤 그 리숑리아 제제제게 메나수요를 슬랍도갈 투메 삼보르자만도 장가제했습니다 와 다디 아주 때서 나란저 지속고 돈에 당기요 말이야 아주 탭소도요 말와 탭소도요 땡 디돈에 아주게 되게요 말 또 쉬엄버저 등산 인지 나로 이자 망고 여배에서 두저도 때 돈아제 즉 은 벽 낭주스라 두갈이야 즉 룸다 창마지 간다 차좀 부주 여버지 롤 차토베나 시야 낭주스라 두갈이야 토르 잡제 sabjedel theory 토소를 차대베나 아니 그 수수 용소고 토네 고들 대와 차가 말와 베나 제종거 버침부슬라베나 제종거 버침부 제제 가리메기 롤롭 차요나 제종거 버침부 꾸제베이네 초함라지오레 제종거 버침부스 암조를 년베이네 야 니딘데 제버다 선담지 롤 차거와 두드디 대양 가란도 쉬엄버서 대 나고고도 등에 디 쉬미 아니 간다 탐놈러버들 짱고름지 투rel이야 즉 법의 시험부터 시윤 그 돈에 릭벨람네 배조 제제 낭주의 대바장장기 돈에 주고 많이 봐 남주 그 배조 제제 낭주 냠는 제제다 낭주 고도 용해지 공부 시기도 투르는 게 요래 디잔 디 제발라 나란주 시험부터 원에 달로 로좀 제나만도 딩마로와 로좀 제고를 받는 중다 등상 야하게 흉 준주 채무를 망부지 인지나 요래다 아니 비유날 공격하면 냉연이 인지나 로샤게나 인지나네 곧 강선 장애요. 다들 제 돈에 수술로 개배 한 탄돔 러버티 먼저 낭주 개침불에 낭주리에 돈아 제거를 써야 돼. 낭주 말한저 배우그리 흉 자시에 돼 많이 봐 제거를 돼 간주 배배 랭게레스 찍고 많이 봐. 뒤에 개도 침불에 탄돔 러버티 수수 그렇게 돈에 캡사요. 낭주 로종 제 낭주 냠래 제 낭주고 고도 레벨은 니리 미지게다리아 삼로당당다 쿠샹류 쿠양류다 강엔 체베간 동련 지다다 망부지게 돈에 수술 캡상 여베인자 탄놈데 낭주 번나 돈나 제베나 캡상 수술하고 왔다디 양아란주 공부시고 지상에 디 쉬면 단데 니구연데 낭주 고연자야 제바 가시 패샤야 이지나 마킹이들 야직 두케나서 투지제
Hello. Tomandela kisila depeola ningtaban tujishuyi ane ngarangi tiwade karesina tanda ngaranzola tumong maimbe nangshusi nujo jagabla tende kedas sago da ngom koy jugere dindo ngaranzo nangshu ti nubjoba tadub jinyamla ngazo tende kejashi ondo ngaranzo nangshu nangla yule yujing namsha yore lende gi namsha yore ane tongni gi namsha yore ane semgam rigbe kor mangbo yore ane 대냠라 양랑서 대바당 이제기 차대양 요라 안 딘데 인도관라 나랑서 눕조베 따dum냠라 나중 조문 지원도 낭축이 얌제디 시용도 당부 고림 직당시요라 판족 로디 규와테라 나랑서 고림 스텝 바이 스텝 아니 조문 지도 강라 나랑서 낭주디 간디진이 아니 펠기 땅거라스 안디 모기시 안 저쪽디 기실라 단다 송송 단다 jam고름 무지게 단다 아주 월음직 소요라 땡두기 세력당 뛰면고 낭주 월음시 담보 송소 디기 사직 내밥 샤당시오라 내밥 고림 샤당 땡두도 판방랑서 대바디 이제 디지고 많이 받자 땡두기 낭주 가서 낭비 세력 오 대실산에 땜벽 지당대 아니 지동기 땜벽 지당대 가리진 지나선 안디 셔도 수중 되잖아.
I'll briefly translate the question in English. The first question was that you know, we are all aware that you know, Buddhism has very many unique features, such as its philosophy, concept of karma, philosophy of emptiness, and the mind science, and so on. So, And there's a lot of potential for entering the dialogue with Western thought and Western philosophy. So when you enter into a conversation with Western philosophy, what would be the best approach to bring it systematically so that you can further the conversation? So that was one question. The second question was, you spoke about these 4 volumes that His Holiness has envisioned on science and philosophy in the Indian Buddhist classics. Can you explain a little bit about the broad thinking behind the way in which the topics are organized in those 4 volumes? So those were the 2 questions, okay? And I'm going to respond in okay. So now that the question has been translated into English, I'll now respond in English, okay? The first question really has to do with skillful means in which you can enter into a conversation with, Western philosophy. Because if you, right from the beginning, bring the concept of rebirth and karma, the conversation kind of ends there. Because science, for one, doesn't accept the concept of rebirth or karma. The karma is a causation across this lifetime. That's a broad way of looking at karma. So then I think, as you can see in Mind and Life dialogues, we had recently the 33rd one in Dharamsala at His Holiness's residence in the temple. One thing that you will notice is that in Mind and Life dialogues, the topics for conversation are always areas of common interest. So whether it is the nature of experience, whether it is understanding how attention works, all of this. So the topics are topics of mutual interest, which then opens up a conversation where perspectives from the Buddhism and perspectives from modern science and Western philosophy can be brought in. So that's, I think, a much more right from the beginning, because I have been part of this right from the start, from 1980. The first dialogue was in 1987. We were very conscious in developing the model for dialogue. Because normally science is very hegemonic, science is very dominant. When science gets into a conversation, it tends to dictate its own terms and subsume whatever it is studying. So science becomes the method of studying, then the other discipline becomes an object of study. So right from the beginning, we were very conscious of avoiding that. We wanted to create a platform, we meaning His Holiness, primarily because he's the main founder of Mind and Life Dialogue. We wanted to create a platform where the Buddhist perspectives and the scientific perspectives will both have equal level of voice, and both sides will avoid attempting to reduce the other one into its framework. So there's a genuine respect. There is also a humility, because often scientists don't have humility. They come with the assumption that any knowledge that is coming from other sources are somehow secondary. The real knowledge are the ones that comes from science. So in the dialogue, we seek out scientists who have a degree of humility, who at least acknowledge the possibility of knowledge coming from other sources than science. Okay? So those are deliberate choices that you make, which then allows a good platform where you can have dialogue. And then the end result is, the results of the dialogue really promote the shared agenda, the shared goals. So that's why Mind and Life dialogues are very powerful, because they really create opportunities where dialogues happen with both sides maintaining the integrity of their own discipline. Scientists don't become Buddhists and say, I believe X, Y, and Z. Buddhists don't give up their Buddhist framework. They're open. There's a genuine respect for integrity of the both sides, but then they promote this common conversation. So that, I think, is a good model. So that's probably one area where you can look at. The second one is I mean, it will take a lot more time to explain the thinking behind the way in which the topics are organized. But to cut a long story short, His Holiness's vision is the following. We have over 300 volumes of canonical texts, just over 100 in Kangyur, and over 26 in Tengyur. And in all of these texts, particularly the Tengyur, His Holiness's view is that the subject matter of these texts can be categorized into 3 different classes. One is science, understanding of the natural world. Second is philosophy, which is more to do with interpretation of that understanding and coming up with a worldview. And third is religious practice. So his thinking is that the religious practice side is very specific to Buddhist, but the philosophy and the nature of reality understanding should really be part of common knowledge. The fact that they happen to be in Buddhist text is more of a coincidence of history, and these are great Buddhist masters who have come up with these ideas, but in the ideas themselves, there is nothing uniquely about religious. So, whether it is understanding of the evolution of the cosmos or, the nature of the atomic structure of matter or whatever it is, there is nothing religious about them. And his hope is to make these first 2 topics, the understanding on the natural world, which could be called Buddhist science, and philosophy, more accessible and available to the larger world. Now, in order to do that, you need a team of scholars who will look through this entire body of 2,200 and something volumes and seek out those aspects of science, those aspects of philosophy, and put them together in a structure that makes sense. And that's what it is. So the first volume is on the physical world. Second volume is on nature of mind or mind science. So the first 2 volumes are science. Third volume is on systems of philosophy in India, Thupten. And the final volume is more specifically Buddhist philosophical views on important themes. And then His Holiness's hope is that by the end of studying all these 4 volumes, the person who is studying will have a very sophisticated understanding of the Buddhist worldview. Yeah? There was, yeah.
Hello. Nge tiwa di dire kare. Nangba da susu nangbara ni nangchu di ke chumbu yume de mangche hago or some susu ki Lebanon peace of mind and like mangche hago or in dang zo shunge namba zo that generation the pay distraction generation de shara technology ta kharitone da thoko thomo so the ideas damenda yore and digi indichini chuji manzu sama la dura samsam indichini ocean do wave do chini la dura ani phama yangje nge dustadi bula chima tabnira kunzola khande rokpa chigore kunga jogi chöda shun khande lab gore di struggle chini indido thonggo do ngarangi thongdana ani the distraction mangbo che cluttered mangbo yo changte clarity the khande susu mitse nanglola da khari khe chumbo me di hagoela clarity goda clarity mena ani chemba chala chunji ani prola doda ani odi pham da nganzola ene phama la ene mitela clarity khande di chugo me clarity yona ngazu intentionally ngazu ni life la di nga nangchu janglo du lan la ju da nge du sadi nangchu jang di ngarang la interest khandeles na ngara life na ngara family la kanye ro chongsra ani dinzo kanye chongdu ani susu chulo la ta thong la chulo la technology la shira distract chang mundura an susu nanglo la duguda susu nanglo la dudu an nanglo gi chowa da nanglo la khande maintain chugo me da dinzo ye manga interest li dura ani 가시도 인데 distraction 망찬이 아니 나몰라 주투고면 딱 강에 여기라 가시라 군저 하고 마고 아니 last life 라 강에 투디 아니 군저 딱 같이 있어야지다 아니 낭 취잖아 그런기 두순저 여라라 딜치나나 군저 원데네
You want to sum up your question in English for the benefit of some of your colleagues? Just the essence.
So I was talking about like how our generation is like we're really struggling because we are so distracted. We don't even know that we are so distracted. There are so much forces out there in terms of technology, and also for the poor, like parents who are doing their best to kind of like help us to teach us who we are and give us the tool that some of the ancient scholars that have worked so hard in terms of teaching us like the essence of Buddhism. But I think that we all know the benefit of Buddhism. It gives the peace of mind. But there's so much other distraction and clutter that it's so hard to kind of make that intention, like what's important in your life. Why is Buddhism really important? Like those. So basically, my question was to how can you give us the guidance as an individual and for the parents to give some clarity to help us have that, to develop that strong intention.
Also, Tuchina. I think you really shared something that was very important, that you began to find the value in Buddhism when you had an adversity in your life, which then left very little room for distraction, but then it had the side effect of making you look deeper into yourself. I think that is a beautiful story. I think that in the end sums up what needs to be done if you want to take seriously the insights of Buddhism. The finding clarity, I think in the Tibetan tradition, there is a practice called Kulon Choba, setting your intention. So setting your intention is supposed to be done in the morning, okay? And setting your intention has two roles. One is to help you connect consciously with your deeper aspirations. Because normally, many of us have aspirations, or at least like to have good aspirations, but we don't think about them, and then they remain dormant, and then they don't play much role in our everyday life. So the intention setting practice allows us to connect with our aspirations. So if we care about compassion, if we care about, being good, if we care about being less angry, if we care about being more mindful, if we care about, helping others. So these are important aspirations that you have. So what you do is you connect with them consciously. The other role in intention setting is to choose a specific task for the day. So if you happen to be, for example, if you had a disappointment in your mark or an exam, or if you were desperately wanting to get this particular job, you have so much expectation, but you didn't get it, it's going to be disappointing to anyone. So then, if it lingers on for days, it can be corrosive. So what you could do is, as part of your intention, you will say, okay, I'm going to confront this. I'm going to deal with this. So you set a conscious intention to do a specific thing. And then at the end of the day, you quickly review your day to see if there is a connection. That's one thing that can really help bring clarity. And sometimes in a difficult situation, one thing that helps bring clarity is to say, what is the most compassionate thing to do here? By simply asking that question, it brings a clarity, because often a lot of our problems are compounded because we lump everything together. And a specific problem becomes this enormous, stress where we have X, Y, and Z. Asking the simple question, what is the most compassionate thing to do here, has this ability to bring clarity. And then along with compassion, you also need to bring wisdom, because sometimes compassionate kunlong or motivation alone is not enough. How you translate that kunlong motivation into action depends on wisdom. Because sometimes you may be very well intentioned, but you might end up doing more harm than good. And this is where wisdom is important. So this is why Tibetan tradition or Indian Tibetan tradition insists on the union of Thupten Jinpa, compassion and wisdom, or method and wisdom. So those are, but there is a bigger question which you raised, which you were not very specific, but because you asked me that question earlier separately, I know what that question is. The question is, when someone gets interested, how do they start? Where do they start? That is a difficult question because, in Tibetan tradition we have 225 volumes of Tengyuru and 100 and something volumes of Kangyuru, and the collected writings of the great masters like Tsongkhapa alone has 19 volumes, Thupten has 27 volumes. I mean, where do you start? That I think is that's an important question. And here, I think probably the best place to start is His Holiness's talks. You should look at some of the teachings that he gives, and especially the teachings that he gives in the West tends to Buddhist teachings, I'm talking about, not the general talk, I'm talking about his Buddhist teachings in the West, generally tend to have a very broad overview and introduction to Buddhism at the beginning, generally about an hour long. And that, having that big picture, and then looking at the specifics. For example, you can decide to spend maybe a whole month, every week or every day, 10 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is, to say, okay, this time I'm going to focus on teachings on compassion and bodhicitta. So you're doing other practices, but your main focus is on understanding Nyingji Chenpo and Nyingji Chenpo Nyamlen and Chanju Gusem, and you read about this, you listen to the teachings that are on that, Lojong teachings. And then you can choose one time, I'm going to focus now on understanding Nyomong, the emotions that are causing so much problem. So then the Buddhist teachings on problems of emotion, how can you become more aware, and so on and so forth. So you can choose. You choose the topic yourself, okay? Then you look for the resources. That's probably one way of doing it. But it's a very untraditional way, I admit, but that's probably a more practical way of doing it. But you start with the big picture that His Holiness gives.
I was just wondering, it ties to this morning's talk on Tibetan identity and culture. So there's like this quotation by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche where he says, a beautiful country is like a dreamlike illusion, and that unless your inner mental afflictions are controlled, then strife with outer enemies will never end. And so when I read about these quotes and I read about impermanence, because then I have conflicting feelings with, Peba culture, Peba identity, Nye Lungba. And then Buddhism is like, no, detach from that, and so about impermanence. So then how do you resolve this conflicting thoughts and ideas?
That's actually, you tend to ask very tough questions, actually. No, this is a very important question because sometimes there is a danger because of the teaching on impermanence and emptiness. There's a danger for someone to say, in the end, nothing matters, everything is empty. So that kind of dismissive strain could come in. And this is why it's very important to understand, for example, like the illusion-like nature of reality presupposes your understanding of emptiness. And your understanding of emptiness requires maintaining a fine balance between respect for a robust reality that is part of your everyday experience and at the same time not clinging to it. Because generally clinging is what gives rise to all the problems. When we are too attached to the idea of me, then everything that is seen as threat to that me, you want to fight out. Okay? So this clinging is what gives rise to emotions and so on. So the idea is to have a view of reality without too much clinging and attachment, grasping. And that's a tough one. And those kind of things one will get there only much later, because you do want to maintain a balance. And that's why the teaching on emptiness requires a lot of study, a lot of reflection, a lot of practice. And then, there's a beautiful, the same question is raised in Shantideva's text, where he raises the question and say, well, if everything is illusion, why bother seeking enlightenment? He says, why bother creating good karma? The question is raised. And he says, just as in a dream, when you experience that dream, you face tragedy. In the dream, the feeling of sadness that you experience is as real as in real life. Okay? So you had a dream tragedy, you have a dream, mourning, and both of them are equally valid. So in the same way, even though in the end you shouldn't cling to anything, but in an illusion-like world, there are also good and bad. So in illusion world, there is also Tibetan identity. So I think it's a complicated question, but I think this is why sometimes there is a tension in the place of Buddhism in a nationalism-based identity, because Buddhism is more universalist. It tends to pull us in all sentient beings' direction, which then has the implication of why should you be particularly attached to a particular identity. But on the other hand, we are human beings. We have our own personal identity. Being a Tibetan does matter. We care for the cause of Tibet. We care for what happens to our brothers and sisters in the plateau of Tibet. So those are, again, part of who we are. So I think it's a tension, but I wouldn't say it's a contradictory tension. It's a tension which needs to be maintained in a healthy way so that we continue to benefit from the insights and teachings of Buddhism without undermining our commitment and dedication to the cause on this side. So it's a tough one, I admit. Thank you.
We have a question here.
Kristile.
Nye tuwa di dikpa kolei, dikpa tsanga la shi samba jowa tartu di tsangwa le ra.
Larem.
Ta pena cha hena michigi ta kesi nga hopta sega ro shili arsara. Na kesi ta noni nye pa midi pa se sha na ta dila dikpa tsangi yo na mena. Igo lo jikso.
Ale self-defense sorry.
Self-defense sunga bishidu.
The question was in Buddhism, in the concept of karma, in order to fully accumulate the karma, there are certain factors need to be complete. There needs to be the intention, there needs to be an object, the actual act, and the culmination of the act in the form of rejoicing or sense of satisfaction. So then his question was, if someone comes to kill you and you kill him back, is there a negative karma of killing? That's a good question, actually. 다 낭벌한경 거에는 제베나 간다 파낭오데 세베 디고 사기오래. 다디 디고 벌써요 말에 간다지. 다 수수 소교배 돈달을 세다 세버와. 레데 이네 따이네 간다 체두니네 다 힌디께지다 마서네 대망 탄다 그렇게 세버다. 지레버 당모지기 돈에 세버다. 파낭오 수세가 용되고리야 아니 수수송겹다 신앙 것도네 파세븐이 전 디부 지중도 개봐요래. 내가 저 팀 것도네 제변에 개봐 셔그러와. 간다지 디마 탄다 그렇게 세버다. 그 카두데 롱라는 세븐이 잖아. 카두데 롱라는 세버다 팀 것도네 얘가 충은 찍어로와. 다디나신 다나데 렌제 레줌제 것도 단래 찍어래. le jumte ko dang ya ji 당분에 차시딩제 아니 세바다 크두데 겐테네 세번이 잖아 디고치 좀 개봐요래 때네 세베 디고다 인다근 다지 소주베 디고 차상 연구에 멤미신 간전에 세사베 슈구들이야 털도 두고요나 다양 세사베 슈구 이슴바 계소나 털도 두고래 다 세사베 슈구도 이슴바 마게 보지 남상 교백게베나 아까당아 고마세라제 계소 빼사서 삼삼 지 교백게베나 양 반항어 미세베 디고 차상지 레기요 말에 다이네 레 줌제기 도단디 레 칸데사기요메 치중 가져요메 디게 뜻이부지 여러서 보시죠 어디엔자 렌데가 남샤 타시 타와 레디걸 탐제 캠바 코네 캔세고에 디스 디중안조 디 대숑 데뉴섬 유르베가블야 징문기 개보조기 계제난제 로자오졸이야 카페네 아니 추 옹바 콩도기 땡주디기들이야 아니 파고잠배알 차체로스 추주체스 nen dode khondoena an sangeda chanju symbol cha chalos tis duyen dene khondoena thamje chembal cha chalos tis the do the ethics ro ba langdo da lejum de got ta de yingo jum sen gen lende ga namsha thashin thawa ship chabul gan le du gala na thamje chembal ma do azu mikyuma ji ga namju phejo cheje choba chetuya yo mare tinza digbe namsha digeti ta ine jidang kulon dan tende ga thone digo chijung la ta tenne ke wandu re तेने छुजु शेंदा नालो या या सेल्फ डिफेंस के तोने सेबे न दिबो योमरा लगुदुआ ते नंगबता या चिबो मारे द नंगबता सेबे शुगुते सेबरा रे खंदा
We have our last question from here.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thank you for coming and giving this teaching. So language and culture are always evolving and changing. With that in mind, where do you see us in 100 years or so with all the outside influence of other different cultures? Do you think we might lose our identity, and are you optimistic about this?
That's a very, very good question, actually. Yes, language and cultures always change. In fact, those that don't change tend to die out, actually. That's the nature of things. And this is one of the reasons why His Holiness has always advised us that we should not be dogmatic in sticking to tradition and customs, everything. He says that unless the culture is able to adapt to the modern environment while recognizing a core element that needs to be constant, if we are not able to make that distinction between customs that can be modified and cultural core that cannot be modified, we are not going to survive. So I think His Holiness is absolutely right. And this is what we see also in the biological world as well. In organisms that cannot adapt to a modern environment die out. And organisms that maintain some kind of constant core but adapts on the environment and periphery tends to adapt and survive. So I agree that cultures and language will change. And language, for example, like Tibetan has, according to Ginjun Chöpel, in the early days, we were pronouncing all the sangurangos and in fact, the superscripts, the letter you put on the top. And in fact, you can see some evidence of that. For example, in Ladakh, they call Choston, Chodun is Choston, Chanoro Chosa Chu, so Sa is pronounced. And Thupten with a Satata is pronounced. So Ginjun Chöpel's argument is that in the old days we were pronouncing all the superscripts, but now we don't pronounce it. And he may be right, but in any case, languages do change. But my own sense is that Tibetan speaking world and Tibetan cultural sphere is large enough, although population-wise we are not that big, but area-wise we are quite big. And our cultural footprint is very large because of our Tibetan tradition and the language being the custodian of the Nalanda, knowledge heritage. Our cultural footprint is very large, disproportionately large based on the number of people that are involved. And if you look at the Tibetan books that are written by Tibetan masters throughout centuries, for the size of the population, the amount of books that have been written by Tibetans is just massive. You're talking about tens of thousands. So I think Tibetan language will remain. I'm confident. How expansive, I don't know. I don't think Tibetan language has the chance to become a global language because it's just too difficult. And for that matter, I don't think Chinese will become ever global language because the Chinese writing system is too complicated to be adopted by foreigners. English became global language because the English writing system is very efficient and very versatile. It's alphabet-based. But I think Tibetan language will remain, and also Tibetan culture will remain, because there is a value in Tibetan culture for the larger world. So I'm quite confident that our culture and our language will remain a couple of hundred years at least. There's the mic here.
Hello? I would like to talk about a very serious topic, and it's about self-immolation. What are your thoughts about it? And also, I have another question after that. What are your thoughts about people calling them Pao Pamo? They get adorned and praised, but what are your thoughts about it?
Can you,
like to know.
What was the first question? Can you put the mic a little bit further?
Self-immolation.
Self-immolation.
Yeah.
And what's the second one?
About them?
What is the second one?
And the second one is people call them, after whatever happens, people call them Pao and Pamo. They get praised.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about that as well?
Yeah. That's actually a very, very painful question, actually. I feel very conflicted about the whole matter. As a Tibetan, I feel deeply for the individuals themselves and the families of those individuals. And as a Tibetan, I can't help admire their courage to be able to go to that extent, to be able to endure that level of pain, and to be able to take that kind of make that kind of ultimate sacrifice. The state of mind of this individual has to have arrived at a very, very, difficult point. So all of this, pulls me in one direction. But on the other hand, I also feel conflicted because in a larger scheme of things, these activities really don't make much dent. And the cost is very high because individuals themselves lose their life. And if you look at the photographs of those who have committed self-immolations, most of them are very young. So that even makes the thought of their loss even more painful. Because imagine out of these individuals, if they had lived another 30 years or 40 years, what potential contribution they could have made. We never know. The future is open. So those things pull me in another direction. Now, turning them into heroes is where I have a problem. I really have a problem because we are then going into directions where certain freedom movements have gone, which glorify certain forms of activity, and I'm not quite sure that's the direction we as a community want to consciously go. And this is where I do have problem. And I'll be very frank. Every time I go to Dharamsala, I do the Kora every morning when I'm there. because it's very beautiful. It's very good for my, mind to be, so beautiful in the morning, just going around His Holiness's residence. I come to the Haigiri point and I see that statue, and I feel conflicted. So this is where, I may be being a little controversial here, but I think this is where we as a community of people who are engaged in a certain freedom movement really needs to ask ourselves, is that what we want? Is that the message we want to communicate to our younger generation? Are we really going in that direction of glorifying these kind of acts? We do have to admire, we do have to acknowledge.
What are the benefits of having and knowing Tibetan traditional values in this modern age? That's the second question. How does today's Tibetan youth identify or understand traditional Tibetan culture? So I would like to call upon the first presenter of group one, that is Stefan, please.
Hi everyone. So we're doing the question from your perspective, what are the benefit of understanding Buddhist philosophy? So we ended up, so we had a really intense debate within our group of 10 people, and we ended up rounding up to 3 points. So the first point is that it provides a rational grounding. The epistemology, ontology, and metaphysics. It creates like a rational basis for academic studies. For example, like psychology, and then if you're doing IB diploma, TOK is a really major thing that Buddhist philosophy really touches on. And all of those stuff, one of those are, that is one of the main point. Lapta high school la lobjong chia la ira subject kechimbu psychology la yago pendo do la ra nang chia la na. The second one is one of the major ones. is controlling your emotions in a day-to-day life where you're like dealing anger or stress or like too much work pressure, peer pressure, or anything like that. Buddhist philosophy actually like really helps you with that. Is like, for example, meditating, clearing out your thoughts, and then understanding yourself, understanding other people, putting yourself in their shoes, and all stuff like that. It really helps. And the last point is finding balance in everything, so that like your world doesn't tip in one side. So it's like you find something wrong. When we say like day-to-day life, we always like, if there's happiness, there's always pain to come, or when there's pain, there's always happiness to come. Everything happens for a reason. Like legumde, karma, and everything like that. It helps you find balance. So these are the 3 main points that we came on. Thank you.
So our group question is, how does today's Tibetan youth identify or understand traditional Tibetan culture? So our group came up with our clothing. So we wear pusunju or we wear chuba, and that's how we represent Tibetan. And also our names have unique meanings, and our names are unique on its own. And also Tenzin, which is almost like 80% of the Tibetan population, which we carry like His Holiness name always with us. And also Tibetan ceremonies, we have lakar, we have losar, we have tungar, and we always get dressed for that, for those occasions, and we represent ourselves. And so respecting elders, and what else? And folk dance, we goshitab shira, sangwa, kibutang. Yeah, that's about it. That's how we represent traditional Tibetan culture. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So ours was question number 1, the benefits of doing Buddhist philosophy. So it's beneficial to us because it helps us live a stress-free life and also be more peaceful, calm, and it helps, and it lets us think about how violence is not a solution to like most of our problems, all of our problems. And it also helps the society / community be more peaceful and stress-free as well. So, and when you do the teaching as well, and other people will like the solutions that you're using, and hopefully you can influence them as well. Trey Wei.
So my group and I, we discussed question 3, which was, how does today's Tibetan youth identify or understand traditional Tibetan values? And so we thought that we understand traditional Tibetan culture through our parents, especially because they're the ones that like taught us of like how to wear chuba and different traditional like things that we do when it comes to like auspicious days. And so we also learn through Tibetan classes here at TCCC, and the classes that we basically know these traditions from are from Durga and also Tibetan language class, which we learn through our teachers that teach us here. And the way we identify traditional Tibetan culture would probably be like the traditional clothing that we wear, and also the music, like through the music we listen to with all of the Tibetan instruments that we know, and also by the food that we eat at home and also at like the Tibetan restaurants. So yeah.
The question my group discussed was about how does today's Tibetan youth identify or understand traditional Tibetan culture. So today's Tibetan youth understand Tibetan culture by attending and celebrating Tibetan festivals and ceremonies, and doing Tibetan dances and learning the language and attending Tibetan classes, and finally clothing, food names, and skin color.
So our group talked about the benefits of having and knowing Tibetan traditional values in this modern day. We touched on three main points. The first one being something that we touched on in the question of identity, our value of compassion and nyingje that is instilled in us through our families and within. It's instilled in us through our families, and growing up, I think we kind of were taught to be selfless or put others before self, and I think that is one of the big Tibetan traditions that I grew up with. And then the second point was in the 21st century, mental health is becoming increasingly prevalent, so I think that the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism or spiritualism is very important in combating mental health issues like anxiety, stress, and depression. So I think the Tibetan values of spiritualism or being spiritual really helps us or equips us in combating these issues. And then the last thing, going back to the notion of community, I think Tibetans have a really close-knit community, and that is, it creates a really strong support system, especially so the close-knit Tibetan community is generally creates a strong sense of belonging. In this day and age, I think it's really important to feel like you are part of something, and I think that is really important in this day and age. Thank you.
All right, so our question was, what are the benefits of having and knowing Tibetan traditional values in this modern age? So we said, as with any other traditional values, they keep us grounded. So they, like, it's not just Tibetan values, but any values in general give people something to fall back on when they have nothing else to believe in. And so in terms of Tibetan traditional values, this includes morality, compassion, and certain family values. In terms of in this modern age, they give us an idea of our own unique worldview that differs from the Western perspective. As most of us here, like everyone here, we've been immersed in like the Western world and things like that, and being able to sort of have this different view of the world to fall back on that's unique to us is something that's important as well.
So the question that my group discussed were, what are the benefits of having and knowing Tibetan traditional values in this modern age? So Tibetan values that we connected with are ones of compassion, forgiveness, kindness, and respect, to name a few. And we feel like in this modern age, a lot of individuals tend to get so caught up with their busy lives and often forget about the things that are really important. So the Tibetan values that I mentioned, we felt like benefits us greatly in our lives, as it allows us to become better individuals and to tackle any difficult life situations that occur and kind of look at it through a positive lens. And on top of that, at the same time, it also allows us to empathize with the people around us and their ways of life as well. So overall, we think it allows us to be better versions of ourselves and understand the world through a positive lens.
And further this dialogue on unique features of Buddhism and Tibetan tradition.
Well, thank you very much. I was keeping tab on which questions got picked up more, and it was very interesting actually. Two groups took up question number one more specifically. Three groups took up question number two, which is about Tibetan values in modern age. The first one was about Buddhist studying the benefits of studying Buddhist philosophy. And then the question number three, which is how do you understand traditional Tibetan values, was picked up by three groups. So it's a sort of almost a kind of a very balanced mix, as if everybody sat together and said, you take this, you take this, you take that. So there was quite a good coordination. I was happy to know that most people who talked about the value of traditional Tibetan values in modern age really brought out the importance of how it actually makes your own life in this very difficult, modern, stress-ridden, culture more balanced. That it gives you skills to regulate your emotion, to create a more balance in your life. And some people also brought up the benefits of Tibetan traditional values, helping us become more empathetic towards other people. So all of these are really very, very insightful responses, which also shows that you yourself have tried this, you yourself have found this. I think that's very, very encouraging. So that's I was impressed by that. And also, one of the things that the modern life throws us is the challenge to deal with overloaded information. We all struggle with this. In this very deeply connected world, there is sometimes a naive idea that what matters is throwing the information out, and as far as how to use it. And there's this basic idea in modern times that the more is better, and that is part of the whole modern ethos of quantity over quality, and which is also combined with a very powerful assumption of modern secular society, which is, as a society, we should not be dictating our values on individuals. Values are a matter of individuals. We should offer the information, and we should leave the choice to the individuals. That is really a powerful assumption of modern secular society, where, particularly in North America, in the Anglo-Saxon world, if you look at many of the cultural values, the one that really tops is, autonomy, individual freedom and choice. That really tops pretty much everything. But then when it comes to the reality, it's very difficult for us individuals to make sense of all that information that is out there and try to make sense and use them. So that, imposes on us some ability to have a more proactive relationship with what is coming into your, perception. With the development of digital devices, particularly the handheld ones, the distinction between computer and communication devices have been eliminated. Distinctions between a work machine and the entertainment machine has been eliminated. So basically, you have the whole computer, powerful computer in your hand, and then how you regulate on what comes to you is really entirely up to you. And this is where I think having some deeper appreciation of the values of traditional Tibetan Buddhism will really help, because in the end, more is not necessarily better. More can lead to more clutter, more can lead to more confusion. So you need to be selective, and part of that selective, and when we choose something, when we select something, selection involves interpretation, because you choose to look at some and you don't choose to look at others, and that already presupposes a certain standard you're going to use. And those standards, it may be conscious standards or it may be less conscious standards, but the standards have to be grounded in some values, what you value most. And this is why the idea of value is a powerful one, because the values are what guides you in your life. And values, when they are violated, you feel out of sync. That's when you know it's an important value for you. So if being honest is an important value for you, when you are put in a situation you have to tell a white lie, it makes you feel uncomfortable. Although you may have told the white lie for an important reason, but because honesty is so important for you, you feel out of sync. You feel kind of dislodged. That's the power of value. So I think values is not just abstract list that is out there and check whether your life is, in concert with that value, with the list. Values are something that stays very deep in you. This is why traditional Tibetan who grew up in a Tibetan parenting kind of environment, from a very early age, when we see someone squishing a bug, we sort of instinctively react, because that value of, valuing the life even of an insect is so deeply embedded in us. It's almost become unconscious that we don't even think about it. It's only when it is violated we feel kind of, a jolt. So that's the power of value. Okay, so this is where, for example, if you truly want compassion to be a value in your life, you have to somehow make compassion come to that deep level, where when you see some uncompassionate act done, it sort of, shakes you. So I think this is where the values, a value is not an abstract concept. So value is really, values are what underpins morality. And morality is basically a set of precepts, what to do and what not to do. But morality is underpinned by values. So values are more like the principles, and moral precepts are more like the translations of those in action. And that's a good way of understanding the relationship between values and morality. So I think it's really, encouraging that people look at Buddhism not just as a set of belief system, but also offering a powerful value. Because the values are what gives us guidance, guideline in our everyday life. So that, I think, is a really helpful one. People talked about, what traditional culture means to you as an individual. A lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of participants talked about the importance of costumes, the clothes, the dances, performances, the language, community life, stories. I think all of these are really important, and those are part of Tibetan tradition. And these are also the mediums through which the traditional Tibetan culture is transmitted. And people living here in Toronto are fortunate because you have enough critical mass. Those of us who are living in Montreal, we don't have enough critical mass. We're less than 100 up there, and divided between the Montreal Island and the outside. So Toronto, you're very fortunate because you have critical mass to be able to afford a place like this. Even if 10% people turns up, you're talking about, several hundreds. So even 5% turn up, you're talking about several hundreds. So you really have a critical mass to really afford to have a community. So I think those who are living here should really feel grateful to the fact that you're a part of this community. And community is also what is going to allow you to have this kind of transmission of culture, to the younger generation. But one thing that I would like to see, and that did not come up in your understanding of the traditional Tibetan culture, is the kind of the philosophical worldview. I think this is something, I don't think we should separate the Buddhist philosophical worldview that is part of the traditional Tibetan culture and the means, the customs, the mediums through which our culture is transmitted, like the dances, the languages, and so on, which are all very important, which also allows the younger generation to engage with the culture more easily, because in order to learn a dance, you don't need to know sophisticated thinking or complicated concepts. But I think in your conception of traditional Tibetan culture, I think you also need to include a bit more sophisticated, higher culture as well. And I hope that teachers who are here teaching on Sunday regularly, and I hope that the younger students who are here, participants, will slowly begin to think about Tibetan poetry. Okay? Think about the Tibetan opera, lhamos. When it comes to the plots, the Tibetan lhamos are not particularly impressive. The plots are pretty simple. The baddies are really bad and goodies are really good, and the goodies win in the end. I mean, the plots are not that sophisticated compared to modern novel writing. But if you look at the dialogues, which are in the form of singing, lhamo, and the vocabulary and the terminology and the language of the dialogue, which are in verses, they're really beautiful. They talk about the description, they evoke the power of the Tibetan landscape, the openness of the vast plateau, depth of the blue color of the sky. All of this is really, and then the association of, Tibetan fierceness, going back to our ancestors, one of who says to be the ogress. In fact, the funny thing is, in Tibetan mythology, the fierce part of our characters are supposed to have come from our mother, who was an ogress, and the kinder part is supposed to have come from our father, who was a monkey, Avalokiteshvara. So it's almost like a sort of a upside down. But some of these lhamo songs really evoke those, and those are part of our traditional culture. So I think, I'm not surprised that these did not come up in your identification of what traditional culture is, partly because you haven't been fully exposed. And when these are taught, they're taught fully in Tibetan, and probably the facility for understanding in Tibetan is a bit more complicated. But I think this is one area I would request all of you to, dig deeper. So the next time the question is asked, how do you identify and understand traditional Tibetan, you have a bit more complicated and sophisticated response, so that it's not only the external expressions and dances and songs and so forth. So, and part of that is really poetry. And, for example, Milarepa's songs are now available in English translation. And the Tibetan of Milarepa's songs are also quite easy, actually. And they are very inspiring, full of Dharma teachings, but also in beautiful Tibetan. because Milarepa songs were written before the complicated and sophisticated Sanskrit poetics came to Tibet. So it's a sort of a more vernacular style. Lamu is not influenced deeply by the Sanskrit poetics, so the poetry is much closer to original Tibetan. So those, I think, I think it would be really helpful. And then on the question 2, I mean, one of the things that someone, I think this is the group 8, which, talked about how, sort of Tibetan values, and particularly the community aspect of it, creates a sense of belonging. And that, I think, is an important one. Because one of the things that modern secular society struggles is the problem of loneliness. And this is the widespread nature of loneliness in modern culture is not a pure accident. It is part and parcel of an individualized materialistic society where, each family is a nuclear family. We are very mobile. Wherever we have opportunities for work, we move our base, uproot ourselves. There's the very nature of modern, secular life, which then gradually leads to a much more individualized, discrete sense of purpose and one's own identity, which then, undermines the social fabric and the sense of connectedness. Of course, then it ends up leading to loneliness. And loneliness is a big problem in contemporary society. And this idea of sense of belonging, I think, is an important one. And when you are a member of a Tibetan community, sense of belonging, the same person, same group also used the word support system. This is an important one. Sometimes in the West, in the secular narrative, we create this narrative of the strong individual, because autonomy is the highest societal value. We prize self-sufficiency and the autonomy of the individual. So we then feel that to seek a support system is to be weak. A strong person, individual, should be able to stand on their own feet, which I think is true. But at the same time, when you don't have a support system, and when you confront an adversity and challenge in your life, in your family, you're really down. And when you have a tragedy, nothing is more acute and painful than when you experience the difficulty of feeling alone. And at least everybody will have problem in their life, but if you don't feel that you are alone, that pain will be much less. So I think this support system idea is really good. When I was growing up in South India, in Hunsur, I was a member of Dzongkar Monastery. And Dzongkar is a small monastery which is embedded in the Hunsur Tibetan settlement, and it was part of Camp 8. I think it's Camp 8, actually. No, sorry, it's H village. We don't have a numbering system there. It's H village. So it's part of the H village town. And H village almost all the members were people from the Tsang region who were working in the Gangtok, Natula road construction, and they moved down to South India. One of the things that impressed me, even as a child, is when there was a death in a family, there was a tradition where all the other neighbors, each family can bring some wood to the cremation ground as a donation, which I thought was a beautiful practice, because the family has suffered a tragedy. They need to carry the body to the cremation ground and cremate the body, but every other family, to show that they are part of the community, brings few logs of wood and make the funeral pyre. That is the power of community. That is the power of support system. And this is where community really makes a difference. And I think here, especially in Toronto, there are thousands of Tibetans. Many of Tibetans probably, if they, like any other, a Canadian family, if they want to live alone and don't be part of community, they probably will survive. If others can do it, why can't they do it? But on the other hand, if Tibetans who, while having this opportunity to be part of a rich community, if they choose to live alone as a single family, they are the ones who will lose. Really, you shun a support system, you shun a community that is already there, and then that will be their individual loss. So I think this point about sense of belonging and also support system, that's a really powerful one, and we shouldn't underestimate it, because one of the beautiful things about community is that you are given a sense of belonging. You don't have to work at it. You already come with a sense of belonging. Whereas if you are living a typical secular modern Western life, the sense of belonging is something that you have to create. Either you have to join a club, or you have to find something where you have a sense of belonging. But being a member here, the sense of belonging is already given to you. You don't have to work hard at it. Those, I think, is really important, and I want to acknowledge that. And also, one thing that was really touching is how everybody identified compassion as a key value of our Tibetan tradition. This, I think, is not simply a slogan. Sometimes, especially in this day and age when publicity is such an important part of branding, sometimes there is a danger we might just be adopting compassion as a branding of our culture. But we cannot, of course, claim exclusivity to that value. It's a universal value. But where we can talk confidently about is the fact that taking compassion as a key cultural value goes all the way back centuries in Tibet. And if you look at all the great historical figures, we have this idea that they are manifestations of Buddha of compassion. There is almost a belief that Tibetan story is a story of compassionate Buddhas, manifesting in different forms to serve the need at a given time. So compassion, the fact that compassion is a key value in Tibetan tradition is, beyond question. But where we do need to work harder is to, in each of our case, ask the question, what does that mean? What should that mean? And what does that mean in my own day-to-day life, in my dealing with others, in the way in which I treat others, in the way in which I see the world, in the way in which I see the people from other backgrounds. So this is where I think saying that compassion is our key value is not enough. You have to make it real. So those are very, some of the thoughts that I had. And, this Gorshe thing keeps coming up. So obviously, Gorshe seem to have really captured the imagination of the younger generation. So I hope the senior leadership of the Tibetan Association here are taking notice of that observation so that they can, stage more Gorshe and probably also teach, because I can do only the first part of the Gorshe, the slow one, and after, when it gets to the real stuff, I don't know which steps. So I think you probably need some teaching as well. So, but in any case, it does seem that Gorshe is a very unifying thing. For some reason, it seems to have become in the Tibetan community. Whether in India or wherever there is a wedding or New Year party, often, like in Dzongkha, when they do the annual cham performance, and at the end, when the cham ceremony is, everything is finished, then the people get around and do Gorshe. So it seems to be something, almost like a sort of a Native American kind of power type. There seems to be something similar going on in the Tibetan tradition. So I think it's good that the children, the students, participants are appreciating that. And also, people spoke a lot about the importance of costumes and chuba. Ladies are lucky because Tibetan ladies' chuba is really beautiful. Our men's chuba is a little more complicated from an aesthetic point of view, but the ladies' chuba are really beautiful. So I think that a lot of people talked about the importance of having costumes and excuses also to wear them on Tungar and many opportunities. So those are really very deeply felt observations, and I hope, since this is a group of very young people, tech savvy, some of you are millennials, some of you are, I don't know what the new generation is called, Z, the generation, lot of you are Z, some of you are millennials, but millennials or Z are supposed to be very tech savvy, social media savvy. So I think you should share the views that you have about what Tibetan values mean to you in living in a modern society. How do you appreciate the transmission of these cultural knowledge and experience through dances and gorshe and so on? I think you need to share these more widely so that other Tibetans can say, that makes sense, because not everybody can articulate well. A lot of people may feel the same way, but not everybody will articulate it. And the more you can articulate it, it will resonate with others. So the younger generation, in the end, the elders like myself can hope to point the direction and try to inspire you. But in the end, the most compelling story will really come from your peers. So whereas if I say something, someone may say, well, he was a monk, he will say like that, he's the elder generation, he's the translator to the Dalai Lama. Okay, yeah, he's a scholar, he can say that, he has time, that's what he does. But if some of you talk about this, then it will be real for the other members of the younger generation, because they are just like you. Whereas not all the young people are just like me, because of the age differences quite massive, So I think, I would appeal to all of you to really use the communication skills and really share with other Tibetans that what it means, because then, one takes off, one says, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I like that idea. And that's how this whole movement of, because while we are involved in protecting our culture, preserving our culture, we also need to make sure that we're having fun, okay? We shouldn't make it as if this is a heavy duty that we need to carry because we owe it to the Tibetans back home. We do. But at the same time, this is our culture, this is our way of life. We have to enjoy it. And if we enjoy it, if we find it fun, if we find it meaningful, that will come through your communication. And that will take off. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
We're extremely blessed and grateful to have you here, Dr. Geshe Jinpa. I hope you keep coming back to such sessions in the future as well. I'm sure you members would like to see you more often here at Foundation Building, and Foundation Building would definitely facilitate such workshops in the future as well. Thank you very much for your final reflection and very enriching conclusion for our afternoon session's discussion, and also highlighting on the points that we missed out in our discussion.
토마델레야 기시 Thupten Jinpa de peode nganzo shengela kugap de now de ning ta ban tujina shue ani on that note perinchi de sobada ganju chundeling la de goti now de ning ta ban tujina shue ye tiwa de tanga phege ge tapsi tangin dara nganzo thare shenge da nangchue parula dewa de shuk chung du samgi dara mix it not just Buddhism but Buddhist practices rituals ra ani the dewa de shuk chung do du gala nganzu shenge ge ta nganzu phame gi mito de la kunzu gi theba de thong do gala monte do thong do ba they see it as almost blind faith so the ge dewa de shuk che khande store like any tips or how do we strengthen that connection again is a question for you. In my perspective, tanga shembat chone samju de kharina munjugi tiwa tidung ala phame danjala ta injup puyegi thunda khare silana erwa sunam sahaji bu rel ane malawache ta non religious thunda de shirab de gyablo yogyo de dilan labna pe shirab hen thosa re samgi de so for example injup puna semna chungtangire yamna kushap china sunam chupu sagi mare ine ya ngarki de chaya yore la da dinde do de she gyana pe pantho du samgi de ra shön bachone that's my opinion ani Thupten Jinpa if you could share what your opinion on that is and how can we strengthen that connection. Thank you.
좋은 것이디 단데 쉔게서다 낭슈게 냠레니 버룰이야 다 제바다 마스네 슉충 누구도 스타디 슉충으로 만들어야 다 답람 다시 가려서디 대대 내가 침부르샤 다 단단디 so I'll probably since the question is more about youth I'll respond in English. There is going to be a difference in the generation, in the way in which we will relate to our inherited Buddhist faith. There's simply no question about that. Your parents' generation they grew up in India. Some of them may have just been born in Tibet like me. I'm turning 60 this year, so I was just born in Tibet. I grew up in India, so probably your parents' generation are the same as my generation. We are quite different from our parents' generation because our parents came to India as refugees with a full memory of what old Tibet was like, and also with full memory of the experience of what it meant to be Tibetan on the Tibetan plateau in a cultural environment where the outside culture was the Tibetan culture and society. They experienced a major disruption in that life, but they brought us up. But we grew up in India, in the Tibetan community, although in India, but we were protected in Tibetan community, Tibetan schools, and with a constant presence of His Holiness in our consciousness. I remember His Holiness's visit to my first school. I was 6-7 years old. So the power of His Holiness's presence in our mind was so strong that even age 6-7, we knew, who He is and what He means to us. So all of this, to cut a long story short, what it has done is to lay in us a very powerful foundation that gave us the emotional connection with Buddhism. Your generation, fortunately or unfortunately, don't have that kind of scaffolding. That is a fact. You were lucky enough to be in the community when His Holiness is still active. He visits many communities, he travels around, he gives a lot of teaching, so you still have that access, but you don't have the experience of being brought up in a network of community where being a Buddhist is part of your everyday life. So then the question is, how do you forge that link? Now, here, I don't think you can do the way your parents' generation have done. Through the yuanjaps, through the recitation of manis, through the chorus. I don't think you can do it easily. Some individuals may have a sort of a mentality which is more devotionally oriented. They may be able to do it, but most of you have to make that connection consciously, on the basis of knowledge, on the basis of understanding, on the basis of understanding the value of Buddhism. And this is why His Holiness's point. The younger generation needs to be 21st century Buddhist, where their faith in Buddhism is grounded in an appreciation of the value and benefits of Buddhism in their everyday life. Because, regardless of what a secular narrative in the West tells us, we are spiritual beings. I make a distinction between spirituality and religion. Religion is an institutionalized form of spiritual belief. We are spiritual beings in the sense that we seek meaning. We are probably the only species in the entire universe that seeks meaning in existence. We seek purpose. So, whether we like it or not, we are going to have some spiritual view, some kind of value in our head anyway. Whether you get it from the popular culture, whether you get it from your school, whether you get it from some exposure to friends, we're going to get it anyway. So we might as well get it from Buddhism. That's how you need to look at it, because Buddhism is part of our heritage, and increasingly many of the modern scholars are beginning to appreciate that Buddhism has a lot to offer, even in this very difficult secular materialistic age. So I think the younger generation therefore needs to, and this is why His Holiness's advice is so important. He says that you need to study. Buddhism demands study. Buddhism demands developing your own understanding. And any faith and appreciation of the value of Buddhism that is grounded in your understanding is going to be solid, because that comes from you. Okay? That is not something imposed by others. And that approach is what is going to make the... And I think just because you don't do the yunjab every day, you shouldn't judge yourself. What matters is not the form, the content. And the content has to manifest in your day-to-day life. And if you are a better person, if you are a kinder person, if you are more grounded, well-regulated person, that's where Buddhism shows its effects. So I think this is how the younger generation can make in some sense, we could argue that the younger generation can make a stronger link with Buddhism compared to the elder generation, because the elder generation's link was more based on faith and leaning heavily on the community. In the monasteries and the lamas and the teachings, they were leaning heavily. They were not standing on their own feet. Whereas the younger generation, if you get interested in Buddhism, your relationship will be even stronger, because this is your story. Because you are convinced, because you have seen the value in your own personal life. So I don't think you should worry that the strength is weakening. Initially, there will be a weakening. That's part of the process. But then a new link will be forged, which I think will be even stronger. So that was the question. Was there another one that you asked, or just one question? That was good. Yeah, okay, thank you. There's one there, yeah.
Hello. Sorry.
Thering workshop de ngarang chede do ngone pe sema pe gaso ngara mangbo shingso ani changmala jikpa ingire peje ani chu pazo ngazo ngara lo dam like lo jikpa do thong ani susu this belonging ki shera ani ondiro si chowa ro jile mase ani susu ngazo changmala ta mitse nanglola ngazo mitse kha dugi nyamdon khala orta shared value jigera odi nga thonga jida broader perspective da nga zong ziksan ma zyo je ziksan na ni go thor ma da chira and then ziksan ma thön je thonga jida o de nga de la do ro sha zo tik the broader perspective tik this ra nga thu je na
I just want to thank all the organizers and also yourself for coming today. And I felt like you were a lot more accessible to a lot of young people in understanding and digesting Buddhism. And so I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that story you shared about like Honsur Shija H's unique ceremony, funeral ceremony, and stories like that. Today was a really good experience being able to be amongst my peers and to have kind of a collective experience of really trying to navigate our identity, which is really complex, especially being young people navigating exilehood and diaspora. I think I would have appreciated maybe in the future and also I would appreciate more of these kinds of events where we could actually have the smaller discussion groups go on a bit longer. And I think that it should be at least, I think it should be facilitated in a very intentional way because we were kind of left to our own devices, which is fine because, you know, like there's organic leaders that come up, but I would have liked for it to have been more intentional, that kind of experience and that facilitation because I don't think we're afforded these kinds of spaces where we really have a conversation about navigating Tibetanness, whatever that means, if that means, if it's a spiritual identity, if it's a political identity, whatever that is. I don't think that we as young people actually get to really talk about the nuances of what it means to be Peba, because, you know, we are managing a lot of things being young, but also being Peba. I also feel like there's like a psychological toll that like we've taken, that, you know, our people have adopted because of living in precarity. But more spaces like this is needed. I would also maybe request you come back and continue these kind of conversations with us. Also because you're not very far. You're also here in Canada. Yeah, I think that an investment in young people, especially in Toronto, because we have a very large you know, group of young people, it would be really beneficial for you to come back and to continue this conversation and to complicate, you know, these conversations as well, so that we don't see ourselves in very like two-dimensional, you know, ways. Yeah. So thank you.
Hello once again, Dashle Yangamani. Just like the last speaker said, the discussions were a little bit too short, and I think it would be better if you had, if we had more activities, and it's like we're sorry. When like the talks are going really long, it like no matter who the speaker is, it gets really it kind of gets boring, and then you kind of lose your focus. So I think it's really better if you have like, because the topics over here, there were like two main topics and really general. It's better if you have subtopics and checkpoints. So like you can kind of like navigate where you are at the moment because you really lose focus. And then activities in the middle, it kind of wakes you up. And then you could also have like an open debate or discussion with Geshe-la and like any other speakers. So those are my two feedbacks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would also like to remind all the participants that we have a workshop feedback
Hello. Gisela, maybe I should speak English, most younger generation. So I was asking Tsoksola for last 4 years to Gisela also at the book release at the Indigo bookstore. So I'm extremely happy that Gisela came. Also, I spoke briefly with Kandola and Tarala. They both are blessed because Gisela can teach every day there for them. And I wish that today is good for the workshop for the youths and the younger generation. And next time Gisela visit, I wish that at least we have 2 days. One day for like more like a youth workshop. One day for like my generation, I'm like 48. So we need like two days, like one day for the younger generation. One day is more like a general public, so that will more benefit. But I'm asking the Tsoksola today, so Tsoksola asked to ask Gisela to invite me to come back next year in maybe like before the Lama's birthday celebration. And also thank you so much for all of you youths. I'm very inspired, very happy. Even though I went to bed at 1:30, I got up like within 5 hours sleep, but I was still happy. A lot of youths came, a lot of inspiration, and Geshe-la, please keep it up, and thank you for your wonderful talk and discussion. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you.
Final reflections, yeah. Actually, I feel a little embarrassed that I'm doing this after all these years. This is my first time, and I live just 6 hours up north. But on the other hand, I was kind of hoping that leadership would emerge for this association that would take this kind of format seriously. And the current leadership, with Sonam Langala as the president, really, and the education committee that they have set up is taking this kind of idea very seriously, because many people know that I'm kind of quite busy, and whenever I have chance to interact with Tibetans, I generally tend to confine it to the youth or the monastic community. Monastic community because I have certain expertise in the very specialized topics of the Indian Buddhist classical texts. And for the youth, because I genuinely believe that our youth can really suggest and point us towards a way of being Tibetan that is much more in tune with the challenges of our modern time. And so I'm very happy to have this opportunity, and I have personally been very touched by the level of commitment and the attention that you have paid, and also the sophistication of your own thinking and bringing the complications of what it means to be a Pöba in this day and age, with all the complex background of our history, struggle, as well as being in diaspora. I feel very happy and privileged to be part of this first formal workshop for the youth here. And my only request is that you keep this enthusiasm, because sometimes people go to events and they feel inspired and enthusiastic, and then after a few months sort of goes back to business as usual. I don't think we can afford to do this. So my request is for all of you to maintain this level of enthusiasm and really continue to ask yourself what it means to be Tibetan. And also, we owe a lot to His Holiness. So I want you to remember that, keep in mind, and that's basically what I want to say. Thank you.
Next, moving on, we have a workshop certificates presentation by
Thank you.